The Queen in the North. Chapter 1, Preparations. What news do we have? Robb asked, leaning against his desk as he looked at Jon. He knew his decision to install Jon on his council had been upsetting for some, but he didn't care. He wanted his brother by his side. Catelyn had protested the most about the appointment, but Robb refused to hear a word against Jon. He insisted that Jon was the only one who knew what was coming from the north. The stories Jon told him had convinced him about what Robb had seen. There would be many who discredit his story about the White Walkers, but there had been many from the Night's Watch who had backed him. There had even been a few wildlings that had come forward to add to Jon's testimony about what he had seen and what was coming for them all. The last reported sighting of the White Walkers was hard home, but there are some reports that they have reached the Fist of the First Men, Jon stated, reading the report from the wall. After Jon had stepped down, Dolorous Ed had been named the 99th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He had often written reports and fortified the wall in preparation for what was to come. We also have a report from Stannis. He says Lord Varys has had some news about Daenerys Targaryen, Maester Tyland stated from the parchment that had arrived from the south. There had been an increasing interest in the last Targaryen, her axe starting to drift across the sea when it became clear that she intended to return to Westeros. Sanira had informed Robb of her vision, tasking their spymaster, Lysono Mar, to discover more about the woman claiming the Seven Kingdoms and the Iron Throne. He says that Daenerys Targaryen still holds Meereen. She offered terms of surrender to the masters of the cities that she had previously visited, Maester Tyland stated, reading the parchment. There seemed no end to the news of what kind of ruler Daenerys Targaryen had been since she had come to power, her actions leaving destructive trials in their wake. Robb sighed. He doubted that the terms would be accepted and knew that the masters had every reason to be upset with what Daenerys had done. He did not have to wonder what the Targaryen queen would do if they were not. Then she will turn her attention to coming here, Jon guessed, crossing his arms. He wasn't sure what to make of that decision, especially when their focus was on the White Walkers. It was the worst timing. They didn't need to deal with some foreign queen who felt like she was owed something showing up on their shores after everything that had happened. That is the assumption. She has an army of fewer than 8,000 unsullied and fewer than 100,000 Dothraki at her side, Maester Tyland recalled. The numbers changed each time that they heard, but it was certain that she had a grand army by now. Barris Tun Selmy and Jorah Mormont were serving on Daenerys' council, the two men having left Westeros before the War of the Five Kings, one after being dismissed as a Kingsguard while the other going into exile. And 3 dragons, Jon muttered, knowing that such things could not be forgotten. He was well aware that the Golden Company had started to prepare for such an occasion. From what he knew of it, they had ways of dealing with dragons and were more than prepared for when Daenerys finally showed up with her 3. Not fully grown, Harry Strickland acknowledged. It wasn't much of a distance, but a 7-year-old dragon was a lot easier to deal with compared to a dragon the size of Vhagar. He had been told that Daenerys 3 measured in at about what Tyrax's had done when he had died during the Dance of the Dragons. It makes all the difference. I would rather deal with a few young dragons than a dragon the size of Vhagar or the cannibal, Harry Strickland continued. It might not have been ideal, but they had ways to bring down such beasts. Daenerys Targaryen was in for a rude awakening when she arrived here. The North would be more than prepared for her arrival, no matter her intentions. Bouncing Osric in her arms, Sanira kissed her youngest son on the head as she walked around the royal nursery. She still had moments of awe regarding her second son. The peace she felt in moments like this made everything she had suffered worth it as she peered out of the window towards the tiltyard. Sanira could see Carlin outside, his archery lesson taking place, and she was so happy with how settled he had become in the past few months. It had been a little strange at first, his early years spent with his grandmother and not seeing his parents because of the war, but they had quickly settled back at Winterfell. Osric babbled in her arms. He was nearly 1 now, and Sanira adored each morning with him, seeing how he had quickly changed each day. Osric certainly wouldn't be their last. Sanira had recently discovered that she was pregnant again. It had been a blessing to find out, and she was eager to secure the line of succession further if she had the chance to do so. Carlin and Osric were fine boys. They were a credit to their parents even at a young age. And Sanira was certain they would both have great futures. Sanira moved away from the window. She had no doubts that they would have a nursery full of children. She was 23 now, and there was still time for her to have many more children. Your Grace, Lyanna greeted softly, stepping into the room. She hated to interrupt her lady when spending time with her son, but there were appointments she could not miss. Work on the castle seemed never-ending in the months since their return here. It seemed like no sooner had one thing been completed than another task was undertaken. The walls of Winterfell would not fall when the army of the dead marched on them. Nothing was being left to chance. Robb was ensuring that nothing would force the Starks from their home ever again. Not only were they preparing for the White Walkers, but the chance they would have to contend with the possibility that Daenerys Targaryen would come back to these shores looking to claim her crown. Ever since the dream that had come to Sanira of dragon fire, she had tasked her spymaster with gathering as much information as he could about the foreign queen. Daenerys Targaryen might have been on these shores, but that was the last time she had been on Westeros soil before fleeing the narrow sea with her brother. It was unlikely that Daenerys knew anything about the world she had left behind. The realm she apparently insisted on was her birthright. Whispers of her building an army to reclaim the throne that had been lost to her family during Robert's rebellion were nothing new. However, in recent months, it was clear that they would have to face her sooner rather than later. Sanira wasn't sure what to make of the woman her second cousin once removed. They both descended from King Aegon IV, who was concerned one of the worst Targaryen kings because his actions had led to the Blackfyre rebellions. Pressing another kiss to the top of Osric's head, Sanira reluctantly handed her son over to the governess before she nodded to Lyanna, the two women leaving as they headed out of the nursery. Sanira had tried to put the vision that Esheed had behind her, but it had been followed by many more of her flying, soaring above Winterfell and across the snow-covered fields towards the wall. Sometimes, they felt so real, and she would wake up feeling like she was missing something, that there was a part of her that she had lost that she could only find in her dreams. Servants bowed as Sanira made her way past. It was still surreal that she was queen, but it was something that she didn't think that she would ever truly feel comfortable with. Arianna and Carrie followed after their mistress. The two had been loyally at her side since she had returned to Winterfell. Sanira was thankful for that. Her ladies were her most constant companions these days. "Your Grace," Maester Tylan greeted with a smile. There was much for them to discuss, and he knew this would be much less stressful after meeting with the king. Discussing normal topics rather than two impending wars was nice with everything happening. There had been enough fighting, and he wasn't looking forward to further turmoil. Chapter 2, Leaving Winterfell. "No," Carlin shouted, stamping his foot. He wasn't going to put on the tunic that he had to wear. Everyone was busy preparing for the trip to Riverrun, and Carlin was no exception since he was expected to be there as heir to the North. This was the first big occasion that his parents had permitted him to attend, and they both agreed that it was time. They wanted to show off their son at an event that many lords would be attending. Carlin was the future king in the North, and it was important for his people to see him. They would want to see how much of a healthy little boy he was and that the Stark line was strong. "You must," Carrie Fry insisted, trying to get the little prince into his clothes. They didn't have much time, and she had to get him dressed for the trip. Carrie had spent the better half an hour attempting to get Carlin ready to leave, and they didn't have much time left. She was sure that Osric would have been the easier choice to get ready for this trip despite being 1 year old. Carrie sighed, attempting to get Carlin dressed. She thanked the gods every day that she hadn't ended up being slaughtered after what had happened. She had kept her head down for a while, not wanting to anger anyone after what had been done. It hadn't been easy. She had been loyal to her queen since the day she entered her service, but there was no ignoring the whispers about her. She and Fat Valda feared they would end up on the wrong side of a war their father's actions had caused. No one trusted Freys any longer, even if they had been allowed to keep the twins. Valda was now Lady Bolton, serving as regent to her 4-year-old son, who was the new Lord Bolton after Roose had been executed for his actions against House Stark. "Carlin, we must get ready," Harry insisted again, trying to get the little boy to let her dress him. This wasn't what she was meant to be doing, but everyone else was busy ensuring everything was ready for the trip. It was rather strange to think they were heading back to Riverrun. They would pass by the twins, making her think about what had happened 5 years ago. Carlin pouted, taking a step back. He didn't want to get dressed, and he wanted to get back into bed. It was cold and far too early for him to be awake. Osric was being taken care of by one of Sanira's other ladies, and Carlin was a little jealous of his baby brother, who didn't have to get dressed up. He was still sleeping, and everyone was letting him. "I don't want to," Carlin replied, shaking his head. He made sure that there was space between them since he didn't want to get dressed. He didn't want to go to the stubborn tourney that his great-uncle was hosting. He didn't want to leave the place that he called home. He didn't want to leave behind his grandmother, who would not be traveling with them as they headed to the place she had once called home. It was hard not to notice a slight cooling in Catelyn's treatment and the look she offered to his Uncle Jon when she thought no one was looking. It made Carlin uncomfortable because he liked his Uncle Jon. His Uncle Jon was teaching him to shoot arrows, even practice with a sword. And Tobin, who had served as Carlin's decoy when the Lannisters came to Becton. Tobin had spent most of the war trapped in King's Landing, serving as a hostage to the Lannisters, who thought he was the real Carlin Stark. Carrie groaned, looking at the little boy. She had no idea what to do with him and knew they wouldn't have much longer left before they needed to move. Packing had been completed for the trip, and most of the Northern Court would be making the trip with them. This was about promoting peace, which mattered. "Do you need some help?" Ariana asked, stepping into the room. She had just finished helping Sanira get ready and knew that Carlin was a handful when he wasn't getting his way. It was clear that Catelyn had been spoiling the boy while he had been with her, something that his parents were eager to correct. They would not allow him to be a spoiled brat. They needed to get outside to ensure nothing was forgotten, and Lyanna knew there was so much they had to do without fighting with Carlin right this second to get him dressed. Sanira took a deep breath and smiled a little at the mist that formed when she did so. The snow crunched under her feet as she left the warm castle behind and walked towards the horses waiting for them. The trip would be long, and Sanira was sure that things would fly by when they reached Riverrun. The tournament was important and would help improve relations between the three kingdoms. They were enjoying the peace that came after the war, and Sanira knew that everyone would have eyes on her and her family when they arrived, as they would be eager to see the king and queen of the north. Robb had been a little unsure about taking Osric with them, but the decision had been made to take both princes with them since people would be pleased to see the royal family together. Catelyn would remain behind at Winterfell to ensure everything was okay. She would handle any problems that appeared while Robb and Sanira were away. Plus, it allowed them to break the news of who Jon Snow really was to Stannis without having to deal with Catelyn simultaneously. Robb was left unsure how to tell his mother that his father had lied to her for years. Ariana smiled, waiting at the bottom of the stairs. She wasn't sure what would happen, but she hoped the trip would make things easier. No one wanted another war to break out after the last one. It had been the worst one in years, and so many people had died during the war that had changed the 7 kingdoms and turned them into 3. A carriage was prepared to carry the royals to the south to keep them safe and comfortable while they traveled to Riverrun, although it was mostly for the children and when Sanira could no longer ride. Carlin was waiting with Septa Miranda and Osric for their mother. He pouted a little, not liking that he couldn't ride with his father at the front of the company as they made their way out of Winterfell. "We are nearly ready," Lyanna said, peeking about. There were a lot of people who would be traveling to Riverrun, and it reminded her of what had happened when they had arrived in Winterfell. Sanira nodded. She was relieved that they would be getting on the road soon, and she was sure that the trip would be simple. She would be glad when they arrived at Riverrun. Her eyes swept the courtyard. She smiled a little when she spotted Robb. He was talking to one of his men and looked rather comfortable for the ride south. It had been rather strange for them to stay in one place after years of traveling. The new normal was not something they had been prepared for, a change of pace that they had fought so hard for. And it sometimes didn't seem real that they were free. The court was moving with them, and Sanira was a little nervous about how many people would be waiting for them. She had done her best to prepare for what came next, especially with her dreams continuing to set her on edge. There was so much riding on the tournament. It would be the first time since they had left King's Landing that they would see Stannis, and the last thing they needed was for anything that could go wrong. "Shall we?" Sanira asked, wanting to get out of the cold. She was starting to shiver, and it would be much warmer there. She smiled at her sons, knowing she would do anything for them. It had been for their sake that they had fought to free the North. They had such a grand legacy to live up to after what their parents had done. Carlin and Osric meant everything to her. She had lost one child, and Sanira didn't want that to ever happen again. She wanted to keep them safe no matter what. It played on her mind even now that she was pregnant again. She thought often of little Ned and what he might have turned out like if given the chance to live. Sanira doubted that she would ever forget her second child, the one taken from her in such a way, a power grab from a family that should have been loyal to them. The war had taken so much from everyone, and Sanira would do anything to ensure another war never broke out. Her dreams warned her of what was coming. There was no ignoring her dreams and the threats ahead that were coming, even if Sanira and Robb wished they weren't. Chapter 3, Discussions. King Stannis, Robb greeted, moving towards the King of the South to shake his hand. The trip from Winterfell had been rather quick, and he was relieved that they had arrived without too much of a problem. Sanira stood on his left, having changed out of her travel clothes and into the dress that made her look every inch a northern queen. Next to Stannis stood Queen Celis, looking rather stiff, and Sanira had often thought that the other woman seemed off whenever they met. She doubted she would ever see her smile. In the few short times that Sanira had encountered Celis, the woman never looked happy, not even during her husband's coronation that had seen her crowned beside him. King Robb, Stannis greeted in return. There was much to discuss, and he knew they would have to talk about the threat slowly dawning on them. There was no escaping the threat that Daenerys posed to the peace that had settled over Westeros. She would overthrow everyone who had come into power because of what had happened to her family. There is much for us to discuss, Robb noted with a grim smile. It would not be an easy meeting, and he had no idea how Stans would react when they had that conversation about Jon Snow. Robb wanted to do what was best for the man he called brother. He had no desire for another war after the last one, but he would fight for Jon if a threat came for him. Indeed there is. Troubling news from the east, Stannis agreed, knowing they couldn't ignore that threat. Coming here was a show of strength on both sides to show how strong the alliance was against all odds. It was bad enough that they had to consider the threat of another Targaryen. It would have been better if she had remained across the sea, but it was clear that Daenerys Targaryen had her heart set on reclaiming her father's throne. Sanira stood silently by Robb's side, her dreams only growing more frequent, and she knew that sooner rather than later, they would need to deal with her Targaryen cousin. Prince Oberyn says that she has built an army and is planning an attack in the coming months, Tyrion Lannister stated, reading from the parchment that had arrived, intel that was much needed as they discussed what would be done. They had fought long and hard to make the country what it was now. It had meant losses for all of them, and there was no desire for another war after everything that had happened. There has to be something that we can do, Robb said, shaking his head. He could only think about what might come to them when Daenerys arrived. From what he had heard, she had amassed an army to take them all out. How many people would die for her version of revenge, for her version of justice? The stories they had heard did not sit well with any of them. Robb wondered what sort of stories she had been told about what had happened, if Daenerys even knew what her father had done, if she had heard the stories about the people he had burned for his own amusement and the war his son had caused. No doubt she had been raised by loyalists, those who would want to see House Targaryen return to greatness. Maybe we should just have her killed. No more House Targaryen, Stannis mused, sipping on his drink. He didn't want to fuss over a girl who didn't know the country as they did. The last time that Daenerys had been here was when she was born before being shipped off with her older brother to live in Pentos for the rest of her life. Once they had thought they should just let her be, she was living her life and married to some Khal who would have no interest in traveling across any oceans to attack a land he didn't know. Killing is what got us into this mess, Robb reminded, shaking his head. This had been brought upon them because Robert Baratheon had tried to poison Daenerys. He hadn't realized what would have happened if she had survived. His thoughts turned to Jon. Would he fall under Stannis' no more Targaryen rule if they weren't careful? Would he have to die for the peace to be preserved? They had to deal with this now, and Robb wanted to make sure she wasn't coming for his blood and his wife and children. He wanted to keep his entire family safe from another war. There were about 10,000 men with her and 3 dragons. There was no way they could defend completely against that, and Robb feared what this could mean. He would lose everything he had fought for. There was silence for a moment, knowing that Robert Baratheon had been a complete idiot while he had been king. His actions had caused a mess still affecting them all. What do you suggest we do? Stannis questioned, knowing they couldn't ignore that she was building an army intending to invade Westeros. He didn't know what Daenerys would do when she arrived in Westeros, but Stannis felt that she would destroy the 2 houses that had stood against her father, which caused her to live in exile. House Martell might stand a chance since they had once been allies, and Elia Martell had been murdered along with most of House Targaryen, and they had withstood the anger of House Targaryen before. Robb opened his mouth, his mind turning to the preparations he had seen made around Winterfell since Sanira's dreams had started back up, and he knew that the Gold Company would be their best bet. The Golden Company has been preparing our realms for a while now. Perhaps we can spare a few men to help you prepare, Robb stated, not revealing just how much had been done since he had returned to Winterfell, that the North and her realms were preparing as they spoke. Stannis nodded at the idea, no doubt that the Gold Company would have ways of dealing with the Targaryen pest that threatened their shores. We could send a team of diplomats to talk with her, Tyrion suggested, looking between the 2 kings. He had been surprised that he had been asked to sit in on this meeting but knew it was an honor. Tyrion served on Stannis' small council, master of coin, as he had done under Joffrey, and he knew that his father's experiences and teachings were why he sat here today. Daenerys knew nothing about the country she wanted to reclaim. From what he had heard, she had been raised on stories that people waited for her return and wanted her back. But the people of Westeros had little interest in such a thing, and the idea that Daenerys might be bringing war to their doors so soon after the last one that had just ended. Let her know we won't tolerate any attack on any of the kingdoms. The three kings are united in this, Tyrion continued, knowing that they had to be united on this. There could be no divides between them if they were going to take on Daenerys and win. Robb, Stannis, and Dorian would not allow her to threaten them. Perhaps a united front would give her reason to doubt her decision to come here. That could work, Robb replied, looking to Stannis. They would send men from the three kingdoms to represent them and ensure that Daenerys understood that she would be making a mistake by coming here. She had to understand that people didn't want her to come back and start another war after the War of the Five Kings. Not when they had the White Walkers coming their way. Stannis nodded his head. He didn't know what would happen, but he hoped this would work. He wanted nothing more than to get this sorted out as quickly as possible. Then we shall each send representatives to this Queen Daenerys. Let's see if we can end this before it's even started, Stannis ordered. Knowing that they would have to be careful who they picked, he sat back, wondering who would be his choice for such a task. Whoever went would need a good head on their shoulders, someone who would not antagonize Daenerys and make the situation they found themselves in more difficult. It would also benefit them to have someone see what they were up against. Whispers about the lack of control Daenerys had over her three dragons were hard to ignore. Talk of the Black Dragon murdering children and sheep was not something they could often ignore. Stannis wondered what she would do if she had no control over the creatures that granted her such power. Leaning back in his seat, Robb pondered the situation and how he would break the news about Jon to Stannis. How could he avoid another war, especially when he wanted to keep Jon safe? Chapter 4, Negotiations. Staring across the table at Robb, Stannis wasn't quite sure if he had heard what he had said right. He looked at the man who was seated beside his fellow monarch, his face revealing nothing that was going on in his mind. The tension in the air was hard to ignore as the words from Robb still rang in Stannis' ears, his eyes locked on Jon Snow as he mulled over what he had just been told. Before him, the evidence gathered upon the table was gathered to prove their declaration that Jon Snow was not the bastard son of Ned Stark and some wench but the legitimate son of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. The documentation proving that the marriage was legitimate had also been found. There would be no way of disproving what they were discussing. Leaning forward in his seat, Stannis' eyes took in every inch of the paperwork gathered to prove that Jon Snow was really the son of Rhaegar Targaryen. "I don't want the throne," Jon stated. Stannis looked up from the documents before him. The room was silent, and Robb stood tall beside the man he considered a brother. He was so thankful that Jon had trusted him enough to bring this to him. He knew that it couldn't have been easy to find out his entire life was a lie, that the man he had called father had lied to protect him all these years. Robb couldn't imagine what had been going through Ned's mind when he had brought Jon home, unable to tell anyone the truth in fear of what Robert would do if he ever found out. "You are the king. I only wish peace and to serve the realm however you and Robb deem fit," Jon continued. He didn't wish for the Iron Throne and was contented to know where he had come from. There was so much that he wished he could ask Ned and his father and understand why he had kept it so quiet for all those years, not even telling his wife. Stannis leaned back in his chair. He saw nothing of Rhaegar in the boy and could easily see how Ned had gotten away with this for all those years without anyone guessing the truth. "What are your intentions then?" Stannis asked the two men. He looked between them, curious why they had felt the need to bring this to his attention if they weren't going to use this information. Robb looked to Jon, knowing that there had been much talk about what would come from knowing he was a Targaryen and that he finally knew the truth about his heritage and where he came from. "We have an offer for you," Robb stated, knowing that this was a delicate matter and it wouldn't be easy, but he knew that the matter could not be ignored when they had another Targaryen on their mind. There was no denying that Daenerys was a threat that could not be ignored, but perhaps they could find a way to unseat her claim if they played their cards right. Stannis nodded for them to continue, his eyes taking in the man he knew that Robert would have killed on the spot if he even hinted that he was the son of his greatest rival. "Jon will swear loyalty to House Baratheon, renounce any claim to the throne for House Targaryen as the head of his house," Robb stated, knowing that this was just the start. They would need to tread lightly as they worked on this. There would be a few houses that would leap at the chance to see House Targaryen restored, and then there were the Martells who might not take the news so well of Jon's existence. You will grant him a title and lands. Legitimize his claim to House Targaryen so that none will doubt the announcement, nor will they see Daenerys as a possible figurehead. Robb continued on. He looked wary at this part, and he saw a frown form on Stannis' face, knowing that this would not be easy. The entire situation was a mess. There were no easy answers, and another king would have called for Jon's head if he had been given the chance to do so. Jon was the heir to a house that Robert had overthrown. He could be a focal point for others to turn to if they didn't like how Stannis was doing things, and the only thing that worked in his favor was that Jon didn't wish to be king. Nothing would change Jon's mind. He didn't want to be king. He'll need to marry one of my banner man's daughters. To bind his loyalty to my house, Stannis noted, adding his condition to the mix. He would want Jon completely loyal. There could be no one who doubted the loyalty to the new king. There would need to be something done to ensure that Jon could not usurp the throne from Stannis and restore House Targaryen to power. Done, Jon stated without hesitation. He didn't even look at Robb as he agreed to Stannis's condition. He would do anything to prove that he was not a threat and had no desire for the Iron Throne. Jon wanted peace after what he had been through at the Night's Watch. He had done his duty, and once the realm was secure from the White Walkers, he would be contented. And to ensure a connection between our own houses, I suggest a match between the Queen's brother Deston and my daughter Shireen, Stannis bargained, looking to Robb, knowing that it was discussed before this meeting. He felt ready to make a deal. Shireen needed a husband from a good house, one that had no claim to anything and would be a supportive figure at her side when she came to the throne once Stannis had passed. Deston was no longer heir since the birth of Arthur's sons. Corran and Deston too, meaning there was nothing for the older Deston back at Airedale now. He was a young man with nothing to lose by coming south. At 16, he had plenty of time to grow into his role as the future prince consort of Shireen, and Stannis would ensure that the boy knew his place in all of this. I am sure Lord Tremaine will be in agreement with such an offer for his younger brother, Robb stated diplomatically. He didn't feel he could say no to Stannis' request for fear of what that might mean for Jon. Deston was a quiet boy. He was currently serving as a ward just like Roland had wanted before the war had started, and he often wrote to Sanira of his time, wishing to come home when he could. Stannis nodded at Robb before he focused back on Jon, his mind putting together a plan, knowing that they had to tread carefully or risk a Targaryen civil war in the future. The room was silent while Stannis gathered his thoughts. It was not a discussion he had thought he would be having when Robb requested a private meeting that morning. The tourney was on everyone's minds. It was the entire reason they were here at Riverrun, and Stannis knew that the Daenerys problem was at the forefront of their minds since it had become clear that she planned to return to Westeros. If legitimizing the son of Rhaegar was going to damage Daenerys' claim, then it couldn't hurt to have Jon on their side in all of this, especially since the boy had been raised by Ned Stark and would be true to his word. Instead of your loyalty to House Baratheon and swearing so, you shall be granted the title Lord of Dragonstone and I shall gift you the ancestral home of your father, Stannis stated with a nod. A new title would be created for the heir to the throne, lands gifted much closer than Dragonstone, and Stannis was sure that having Shireen at court would boost her potential. He would not make the same mistakes as King Viserys. He would not have his designated heir unprepared to rule nor away from court when she was learning the role she would one day be given. Jon nodded, not knowing what to say to such an offer. Some of him had been convinced that Robb's plan to be upfront with Stannis about his heritage would backfire and end with his execution and all-out war. Then there is nothing else to discuss. We'll have a ceremony to confirm you once everything else has been arranged, Stannis stated, getting to his feet. He had other things to do that day and knew much to be discussed. Robb nodded his head. He was sure that Sanira was eager to hear how the meeting had gone, and he knew the boys were full of energy since arriving at Riverrun. What do we call you now anyway? Stannis asked, turning to look at Jon before he left the room, his eyes taking in the man who was clearly starker than Targaryen. And he knew that without the evidence, no one would believe such a story. Jon hesitated momentarily, his eyes casting down to the papers before he met Stannis' gaze and repeated the name his mother had given him. Daeron. My name is Daeron Targaryen, Chapter 5, Lord Daeron Targaryen. Sitting upon the dais, Stannis stared at Howland Reed, taking in the Lord of Greywater Watch, who had been with Ned Stark when he had gone to get his sister from the Tower of Joy but instead had left with his newborn nephew. Howland Reed stood before the gathering, recounting the day that had seen the death of Lyanna Stark and the start of a lie that would span 2 decades, hiding the truth about Jon Snow from the realm. He was one of several witnesses called forward to testify that Jon Snow wasn't truly Jon Snow but Daeron Targaryen, the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. The gathering consisted of every notable lord and lady in the three realms. People had been called together from across Westeros to come to see the trial taking place. The evidence shown and legitimized by the Masters of the Citadel confirmed that the marriage between Elia Martell and Rhaegar had been annulled shortly, followed by the marriage of Rhaegar and Lyanna. It had been difficult for the Martells to hear. King Dorian revealed nothing as he sat listening to the testimonies, and each called upon them to testify that Daeron Targaryen was who he claimed to be. Robb was seated between Stannis and Dorian, the tension growing with each testimony and question probe, knowing this was necessary. Catelyn Stark sat quietly in the crowds beside her brother and his wife. She had been called down to Riverrun to witness what was happening, her face revealing nothing of the betrayal she felt. Robb had broken the news to his mother in a private meeting when she had arrived. The look of fury and betrayal on her face was one that Robb doubted he would ever forget. Even now, she could not bear to look at Jon, whether that was because she was ashamed of how she had treated him or something else no one but Catelyn knew, but avoided Jon at all costs these days. "Thank you, Lord Reed," Robb said with a nod as the Northern Lord left the stand where he had been giving evidence, one of many testimonials they had heard that morning. It had been a long day of hearing other people talk and securing the fact that Jon Snow was Daeron Targaryen, and it wasn't over yet. "Lord Dane," Stannis called to the Lord of Starfall, signaling for the man to come forward and take the stand. The man in question made his way forward, a grim look on his face as he passed by Catelyn before taking to the stand. There was no emotion on his face, nothing to give away the man's feelings on the matter at hand. The only thing anyone could tell was that Lord Dane would rather be elsewhere. "Your brother Arthur wrote to you, did he not?" Stannis asked, wanting to get this over with. He had no desire to drag today out more than needed, and it was more a formality than anything else. A decision had already been reached to show that they sat here, legitimizing that Jon Snow was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen before the people. He did, Lord Dane agreed with a stiff nod. He had produced the letter when asked. House Dane had always been loyal to House Targaryen, so he had kept the letters for all these years. Proof that Jon was who he claimed to be, proof that he was the rightful ruler, but alas, it seemed the boy was foolish enough to give away his birthright for peace. He wrote of Prince Rhaegar's plans to annul his marriage to Elia, to wed the Stark girl, the wedding, the pregnancy, and the birth of Daeron Targaryen, Lord Dane summarized. His words had no beating around the bush, and he wanted this over immediately. Arthur had written to their sister to discuss what was happening, fearing what would happen should the truth come out when war broke out across the realm. "You kept it secret?" Robb noted, knowing that there would have been many that would have sold out Ned Stark's actions, especially with the rumors surrounding what had happened to Lady Ashera. Many would have wanted to curry favor with the new king. Robert had made his feelings on Targaryens more than clear in the past. "I saw no reason to upset the peace," Lord Dane said, shrugging his shoulders. He could still hear his dear sister's pleas to not tell Robert about the boy, her begging him that only more death would come if he said anything. Noble Ned Stark had dropped off Arthur's sword only days earlier, an apology on his lips as he avoided looking at Ashera as he held the baby in his arms that by all rights should have been the new king of the Seven Kingdoms. His father and older half-brother were all slaughtered in the rebellion that had seen many lose their lives and a royal wedding taking place not long after. Lord Dane would say no more on the matter. He nodded to the three kings before stepping down from the stand and leaving the room filled with whispers. Many were eager to look at Daeron Targaryen, the man seated beside the queen in the north while the testimonies had been taking place, the young princes absent from the boring talks that were taking place. "Daeron," Stannis called after a moment, his eyes focusing on the man who looked uncomfortable about all of this, the man that everyone was talking about, who doubted he would ever get used to his own name. Jon moved from his seat, standing and bringing the hall to silence. He moved to stand before the three dais, unable to meet the eyes of the Dornish king. Dorian had been silent through these proceedings, some deal having been worked out between him and Stannis in private, which would no doubt benefit the Martells with everything going on. Jon kneeled before the throne, his eyes lowering as he readied himself for what came next. There was no going back now. He doubted that he would ever truly go back to the north again after this. "I pledge myself and those of my line to House Baratheon and relinquish any claim that myself or my descendants might have for the throne," Jon said, making sure that his voice was clear. He would do whatever it took to keep the peace within the realm. It was bad enough that they had to deal with the White Walkers. This wasn't the time for a succession crisis to the throne, not when the dead were coming for them. I, Stannis of the House Baratheon, King of the South, Protector of the Realm, recognize Lord Daeron Targaryen as the heir to House Targaryen and grant him the title and the ancestral lands of Dragonstone. Stannis stated from his throne, a crown upon his head as he granted what he had promised upon the former Stark bastard. I am most grateful, Your Grace, Jon stated, knowing that there was one part of the agreement that he had yet to live up to. He had to find a wife from the ranks of nobles loyal to Stannis, a task that he wasn't overly fond of at this time. There had only ever been one woman for him. He doubted that he would forget Ygritte any time soon. Her flaming red hair seemed to haunt him in his sleep these days. I would be honored to take one of your Grace's bannermen's daughters for my Lady of Dragonstone, Jon stated with a wary smile. He stood from his position as he tried to ignore the eyes buried into the back of his head. Across the room, Laena Velaryon watched the unfolding scene with great interest from her position beside her younger brother, their uncle having joined them for the tourney. Tension-filled talks had filled the air around the Velaryon tent, with their uncle doing everything to undermine Montrese and Laena. It was clear that their dear uncle was eager to push the orphan siblings out of the way. He often talked about how he would marry Laena to one of their minor cousins, better support his dear nephew, and teach him all about the sea. Clearly, their uncle desired the Velaryon titles and lands for himself. Lena's father had banished him from Driftmark for his power-hungry ways, and now she could not rid herself of him. I shall wed Daeron, Laena stated without realizing it, the words slipping from her mouth as she stepped forward away from Montrese and towards the new Lord of Dragonstone. Without her permission, an idea formed in her mind. She could secure her brother in his role as Lord of Driftmark and ensure their uncle could no longer control them. Jon turned to look at the woman who had spoken, her head held high and her eyes shining with something he could not quite describe as she stood beside him. Behind her, Corwin Velaryon glowered at the back of his niece's head, knowing he could not allow such a match to happen. Chapter 6, The Targaryen-Velaryon Alliance. Have you lost your mind? Corwin Velaryon hissed, grabbing Lena's arm and pulling her to the side, his grip tight as she tried to shrug him off and walk away from him. Laena glared at her uncle. She couldn't believe he was acting like this in public. She thought that he would have understood why she had done this. After all, it wasn't a secret what he planned to do and how he planned to unseat her brother from the lands and titles left to him upon the death of their father during the Battle of Blackwater. I am of sound mind, uncle, Laena scolded him as she turned to face the man who would happily murder her brother if that meant that he could be the master of Driftmark. Laena didn't trust Corwin for a moment. Her ambitious uncle had been lurking around since before her father had passed away and had been devastated when Lena's mother had birthed Montrese, displacing him as heir to Driftmark. Then why would you offer yourself up as the wife of the Targaryen bastard without the blessing of myself? Corwin accused, shaking his head. He didn't care that Stannis or anyone else believed that Jon Snow was the legitimate son of Rhaegar, was a bastard to him. As the head of their house until Montrese came of age, it was on him to organize a marriage for Laena, and he had planned to wed her to his own son to secure his own succession. I do not need your blessing to do anything. My fate is in my own hands. Just as my father decreed before his death, Laena spat at her uncle, her eyes taking in the room to see if anyone was watching them right now. This was a fairly public gathering, with many celebrating the day's events and talking about the tourney that was still taking place despite everything that had happened that day. Corwin pulled Laena closer. He refused to believe that she would actually go through with this marriage and that she would shame their family like this when she could marry Vaemond instead. How dare you? I am your caretaker. I will not consent to this match. Corwin raged silently. He glanced around, not wanting to attract any further attention than needed to this conversation. House Velaryon was held in high regard among those loyal to Stannis. They had sworn themselves in the early days of the war and had never looked back. If I could borrow my betrothed for a moment, interrupted a voice. Laena and Corwin looked to the side to see an awkward-looking Jon Snow beside them. His eyes caught on the hold that Corwin had on Lena's arm before offering his own to the woman who had pledged herself to him only a few hours ago. We have much to discuss before our wedding tomorrow, Jon noted with an awkward smile. He resisted the urge to turn around and punch Corwin for laying his hands on Laena in such a way. The last thing he wanted was to cause trouble when things were still fresh, and people were only now getting to know him as Daeron Targaryen rather than the bastard son of Ned Stark. Laena smiled at him, linking her arm with Jon's and allowing him to lead her away. She didn't look back at Corwin or his scowling face as he watched Laena walk away with Jon. "Thank you," Laena whispered to him. She had no idea what he was like, and she had only heard stories of the Honorable Ned Stark. She guessed if he was anything like his cousin, then it wouldn't be so bad. Jon Snow was an unknown entity, especially now as Lord of Dragonstone, the ancestral home of the Targaryens, returning to the rightful heir after all this time. It had been Stannis' home during the reign of King Robert, a place that had seen much tragedy during that time, and even Laena had heard the whispers of what happened there regarding Queen Celis. "My uncle is a rather prickly man, especially when he's got getting his own way," Laena explained softly. She doubted that many things would make him happy except getting what he desired. Looking down at her arm, Laena had no doubts that there would be a bruise there later on, considering how hard he had been holding onto her arm. She was just relieved that soon she would not have to deal with him anymore. "I can imagine," Jon said, leading Laena to a private space where they could talk. He had been serious when he said they had much to discuss with them because they were expected to marry tomorrow. Stannis was leaving no room for arguments. He wanted everything to fall into place and be dealt with before the tourney's end. He wanted nothing popping up further down the line. Corwin's eyes didn't leave the couple as they crossed the room, his face displaying his displeasure at what had just happened, and he couldn't believe that the Targaryen bastard had interrupted him in such a way. "Why did you agree to marry me?" Jon asked, looking to Laena, stepping away from the crowded gathering and the noise to finally speak with his intended. It was surreal that he was to wed. He had never considered having a family. He had always been so set on joining the Night's Watch that he had known that any child he'd have would be stuck with his bastard name. Now, here he was, about to marry a noblewoman with a fine name and a heritage behind his true name, which he had to live up to and give to his children one day. Laena took a deep breath, pulled away from Jon, and turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his face as she decided what to say. "You looked like you needed an ally," Laena stated with a shrug of her shoulders, her eyes casting away from Jon towards her younger brother for the briefest moments, a frown setting upon her face seeing their cousin, Vaemond, with Monterey's. "And it seems that I need an ally myself," Laena admitted quietly. She closed her eyes, turning her full attention back to Jon, knowing there was little point in remaining quiet on this matter. As much as Laena needed Jon, without each other, they were in serious trouble, and Laena knew that she could not afford such a thing to happen. "My uncle seeks to displace my brother from his rightful inheritance since our father's passing," Laena murmured low enough for only Jon to hear. There would be no friendliness from Corwin, and he would only likely cause trouble more when the pair had married. Corwin was not a man who would take the slight of losing control of Laena well. He wanted the power from being head of the house and had just lost his bid for control with her agreeing to marry Jon. "I will help you smooth out any issues with the Southern Lords, and in return, I would like your support in securing my brother as Lord of Driftmark," Laena explained. She had no idea about their future but knew she would do anything to keep her brother safe. He was the last member of her family that she had. She didn't trust their uncle for a moment and knew that he'd happily murder the 12-year-old to get what he desired most. Jon stared at Laena, a lump in his throat as he looked past his bride towards her uncle, who was whispering rather furious with a man Jon had been told was his son. "In return, I shall be a loyal wife to you. I will mother your children and support any cause that you desire. I want my brother safe. I can't watch my uncle overthrow everything my father worked for." Laena bargained with him. She had heard much about Ned Stark from her father. He had fought with the man during the rebellion and had nothing but praise for him. Montfort had been disturbed to hear of the execution of Ned Stark. The man had warned Stannis about the truth before Joffrey Baratheon had him executed to cover up the fact that he wasn't truly Robert's son but the bastard son of Queen Cersei and her brother Jaime. If Jon was anything like the man who had raised him, Laena knew she would be in good hands. After all, he was raised by King Robb, and she had seen how Robb treated his wife, Sanira. When Sanira was in the same room, just one look at Robb told anyone how much he adored his pregnant wife, the queen already expecting her third child. "I shall help you in any way that I can," Jon said, not sure how much help he would be in this regard. He didn't have much pull in the south that he'd had in the north where he had been Robb's second in command since the war had ended. His brother had treated him well, and he owed much of what he had to Robb, the man who had his back even now, and he would always see the Starks as his real family. It didn't matter to him what name he carried or what titles he had. He was still Jon Snow, and that name mattered to him. Chapter 7, The Greyjoy Civil War. "The Glovers have retaken Deepwood Motte," Yara Greyjoy told her father as she entered his presence chamber. He was seated before the fire alone with no company. The room was dark, and the only light to be seen was from the fire. Yara had gotten the news before her father. She seemed to have taken on many of his duties as of late, and she couldn't recall the last time he had left Pike. "And the Ironborn who held it?" Balon asked, not looking up from the soup he was having. It was quiet apart from the storm that raged around Pike. He stirred the soup that the kitchen had brought up for him. No doubt instructed to do so by his wife, Alanis had always been good at that, although she avoided him these days, preferring the quiet of her chambers after the death of the sons. "They died fighting to the last man," Yara stated, staring at her father. She had disagreed with him in holding Deepwood Motte, especially with the Northern Army back from war now. In her opinion, it would not do for them to anger their neighbors more than necessary. They needed allies, especially now that Westeros had been reshaped and were left outside in the cold. "What is dead may never die," Balon stated, dismissive of the men's deaths. They had died fighting. And that mattered. They would be rewarded in death for the work in life, no doubt. They had done as their liege lord had asked of them. They had fought for the Ironborn's expansion, which mattered to him in the end. Lands could be reclaimed all the time. Yara echoed her father's words before placing the piece of paper that she had been reading from on the table, a look of disgust on her face at how insensitive he was about the deaths of those men. "What is dead may never die. But they did, and our invasion died with them. Deepwood Motte was our last stronghold on the mainland," Yara pointed out. Nothing had been gained from her father's actions since this war had started. Everyone else was enjoying peace now. Yet it only seemed to them that they were trying to carry on the fighting from the last 7 years that had started with the execution of Ned Stark. "Then we will take more," Balon instructed with a nod. He brought the spoon back to his lips to carry on eating as if he wasn't wasting the men they did have on a reward-less errand. There would be no winning in this. Yara scoffed at his words, knowing that this could only end in tears, and the people would grow tired of her father's pointless war. "Why? For more pinecones and rocks?" Yara spat, knowing that little could be gained from angering the North right now. She had already suffered the loss of her brothers for her father's ambitions. Roderick and Meryn had been lost during the rebellion within a few weeks of each other, while Theon had first been taken from them as a hostage. Then, because of their father's goading, he tried to take Winterfell, which brought his death in the end. A part of Yara wondered if her father was determined to sacrifice all of his children to watch her mother fall apart when their family was destroyed by her father's ambitions. "Because I order it," Balon stated, turning to face Yara from his seat by the fire. He glowered at his daughter, his only remaining child in the world and one day his heir. It was his will that they carried on with his ambitions for the North. People would fall in line and be grateful for the glory that. "We can defeat anyone at sea, but we'll never hold lands and castles against mainland armies." Yara tried to reason with her father. She didn't see why he was so set on the path that he was taking nor why he would risk it when nothing was distracting the North anymore. "Not if our captains defy my orders, abandon their posts, and sacrifice our men on a foolish mission." Balon spat at Yara. He blamed her for what had happened to his hold on the North and how it had all worked out. Yara had risked it all for nothing in his mind. They would have been stronger if she had not done as she had and ridden on Winterfell. "I won't apologize for trying to rescue Theon," Yara replied, knowing exactly what he was thinking of. Even now that he was dead, she wished he'd been able to save him from the fate that had befallen him. "Then where is he?" Balon snarled, knowing that if Yara had not wasted their resources, the answer would have been simple. Theon had died a fool, and even Yara's failure to rescue him had not changed the boy's fate. "Where is your kingdom?" "We took those castles because the Northerners marched off to war. That war is over. The last time we provoked them too far, I watched from that window as they breached our walls and knocked down our towers. I lost 2 brothers that day," Yara spat, shaking her head. She refused to allow her father to punish her for his own failings as a leader. She had done what she could, and she would never apologize for trying to spare her mother from burying another child. Balon stood from his seat and moved towards Yara, who did not back down. She was his heir, after all, and she refused to be bullied by him into silence for something she did not believe in. "And I lost 3 sons. The War of the 5 Kings, they call it. 2 of them are dead, the others split the kingdom between them, and I remain. You can wage all the peace you want when you rule the Iron Islands. But for now, shut your mouth and obey, or I will make another heir who will." Balon spat at Yara. The 2 of them stared at one another when the door to the chamber opened, and Alanis stepped inside. having heard the commotion from down the hall. Her eyes looked between her husband and daughter, her hands clasped before her as she moved the prayer beads through her fingers. She often found herself in this position these days. I heard yelling, Alani stated calmly. She was the person to bring peace to their fractured family, and she knew that Balon grieved the death of their sons just as much as she did. He wanted to leave a grand legacy to Yara, one where it would have been worth the losses of her brothers, but even Alanis had to question her husband's continued actions when they had no more to lose. Balon scoffed before storming out of the room, his supper left to go cold, while Yara sighed and turned to her mother. She just wished that her father could see what damage he was causing. The men were displeased with him. They whispered about his desire for lands they could not hold, especially with how strong the North was under the rule of King Robb and Queen Sanira. Making his way out into the storm that raged around Pike Castle, Balon Greyjoy could not help but ponder the situation that he currently found himself in with the death of his youngest son and heir. When Yara had broken the news to him of Theon's death, she spared him the details even if he knew that something more had occurred, only that Theon was not Theon anymore after his time with the Bolton bastard. The boy had died of his injuries. According to Yara, he had been comfortable in his death, and the Starks had given him an honorable send-off that no one could argue against. Lightning lit up the sky as he stepped onto the unsteady bridge, his hands resting upon the ropes as he moved into the storm. The rain was pouring down upon him as he reached the middle of the bridge between the two towers of Pike Castle. Balon was leaning upon the ropes as he looked down at the ocean below him. Then he noticed he was not alone. A cloaked figure on the other side of the bridge appeared in his vision as if from nowhere. "Let me pass." "You fool, move aside for your king," Balon ordered, moving to continue across the bridge, his hands resting on either side of the rope as he tried to make his way down the bridge that swayed in the storm. "Haven't I always, brother?" the figure asked, recovering his hood to reveal his identity, a smile on his face as Balon took a few steps towards him. It had been many years since the two brothers had last seen one another. "I thought you'd be rotting under some foreign sea by now," Balon stated, staring at the younger brother. He had never thought he would see Euron again after disappearing from the sea. Euron laughed at his words, dismissing them as if they had been lost in the storm around them. It seemed to worsen with each passing moment. "What is dead may never die," Euron stated, the words that he and his relatives often used. He received no response from Balon, who stood motionless upon the bridge, refusing to engage with Euron. "Has the custom changed since he have been gone? Aren't you supposed to repeat the words?" Euron queried, rather amused by the look on Balon's face. He knew that the custom had not changed. It was just Balon being Balon. His brother was a stubborn old fool who could not see what was before him until it was too late. "You can mock our god without my help," Balon stated gruffly. He was in no mood to deal with his idiot heretic brother, who had clearly lost his mind many moons ago. Nothing good could come from Euron's return. No doubt he was bringing more trouble in his wake than Balon needed, especially if what he heard about his others' travels was correct. "I don't mock the drowned god. I am the drowned god. From Old Town to Karth, when men see my sails, they pray," Euron stated, spreading his arms in the air as the wind buffeted the bridge back and forth. Balon tries to preserve his balance while Euron laughs at him, unfazed by the winds that sway the bridge they both stand on. "You're old, brother. You have had your time. Now let another rule," Euron dictated. He knew that it was his time and he could bring the Ironborn into greatest. He already knew what he had to do and had made the sacrifices to do so. Balon walked towards his brother, his head held high, and he refused to listen further to Euron's delusions. "I heard you lost your mind during the storm on the Jade Sea. They tied you to the mast to keep you from jumping overboard," Balon stated. Having heard the story quite recently, he had no doubts, especially given his others' delusions in the past. No sane man would follow Euron. He was a recipe for disaster, and no matter what happened, the line was secure with Yara. Euron would have no hopes of taking the throne with her in the way. "And when the storm passed, you cut out their tongues," Balon continued after Euron affirmed the story. He eyed his brother, wondering what had brought him back. He could think of nothing drawing Euron back to Pike after all these years. "I needed silence," Euron stated calmly as if it was the most obvious answer in the world. Nothing that Balon could say would upset him. What kind of an Ironborn loses his senses during a storm? Balon taunted him with a look of displeasure as he stood just feet from the brother he had not seen in years. "I am the storm, brother. The first storm and the last. And you're in my way," Euron stated, stepping closer to Balon to get in his face, his eyes revealing why he had come home after all these years. He heard the tales of King Balon, how poorly he handled the Iron Islands during the war, and how he had allowed greatness to slip through his fingers after all this time. Balon drew a knife and slashed at Euron across the face, only to have something plunged into his very own back, making him cry out. His voice was carried away by the storm as he turned to face the blonde-haired woman who had stabbed him in the back with a smile on her pretty face. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Lyanna Lannister," Euron stated with pride. There was no denying that his match would secure the throne in his favor. Lyanna was a rich woman in her own right, the rightful heir to Casterly Rock and its riches. She was destined to be queen. With her by his side, there was no way Euron could lose. Then, Euron grabbed onto his brother and threw him off the bridge, Balon unable to steady himself or grab onto the rope to stop his fall this time before he plunged into the waves below. Lyanna watched Balon go, her hands covered in the man's blood, and she knew that this was just the start. Everything that she had ever done was for her survival, and nothing could stop her. Euron grinned at her and stepped forward. He took her hands that were covered in his other's blood and brought them to his lips to kiss. The storm continued to rage around them, both of them knowing that soon they would have everything that they desired and more. The funeral of Balon would be a quick affair, especially after he had fallen to his death and was lost to the sea. Euron had all but assured his consent to the throne. There would be no one better to rule the Iron Islands but him. His brothers would surely agree as he was the rightful heir with Balon's sons dead. Arianna felt a surge of power. First, the Iron Islands would fall to her feet, and then she would focus on making those who brought down House Lannister pay for what they had done. Standing by the ocean, Balon's funeral was only the day before, with those able to step forward to be the new king of the Iron Islands around them. The ocean was calmer than it had been for days, and there was a sadness in the air. Lyanna stood by her daughter as she looked around at the men who would attempt to decide the fate of her family. She dressed in black as she had done since the death of her eldest sons. "We speak in the presence of the drowned god. In his name, we, Father, today, choose a new king as our leader." "Who makes a claim?" Daeron asked, looking around the gathering of Balon's relatives. It was Yara who stepped forward first. She held her head high, knowing that this wouldn't be easy. She was more than aware that there would be those who disagreed with her putting her name forward. "I am Yara Greyjoy, daughter of Balon Greyjoy, king of the Iron Islands. I claim the Salt Throne," Yara stated loud and clearly. She looked around the gathering as she prepared to claim her birthright. As the last child of Balon, she was the obvious choice of heir, and she saw no reason that it should not be her. She was everything that Balon could have asked for in an heir. "We have never had a queen. Not once." One man called out. It was true that in all of Iron Island's history, there had never been a queen elected to claim the Salt Throne. It would make them wary of electing a woman for the first time. It would be an uphill battle, and no matter the fact that 2 of her 3 uncles were in attendance. "There are many things we have never done. We have never made our mark upon the world. The great lords of Westeros pay us no mind until our little raids buzz through their kingdoms long enough to become a nuisance. Then they swat us down. They conquer us, humiliate us, and go right back to forgetting we exist," Yara stated, knowing that she had to get the people's side. Yara looked around, knowing she had fought with many of these men. They had served on her ships and knew what she was about. "We are a sea people. Our god is a sea god. When I am queen, we will build a fleet," that Yara continued, by another man who yelled that she could not be queen since she was a woman and male relatives were present. "She is your rightful ruler. Those of you who have sailed under her and many of you here, you know what she is. She is a reaver. She is a warrior. She is iron-born. We will find no better leader. This is our queen," Lyanna shouted to the men. She would defend her daughter's rights until her dying breath. For too long, she had been silent. Had she sat back and watched the world move on after she had lost her sons? She refused to allow them to take away what was her daughter's right. She was Balon's heir. Yara stared at her mother as the men cheered and chanted Yara's name. She nodded to Lyanna, knowing that she had not expected her mother to speak up for her at this meeting. "I'm Euron Greyjoy," called a voice from the crowd, the men falling silent at the voice as Euron appeared through the crowd and walked towards Yara and Lyanna. Lyanna looked far from pleased to see her brother-in-law. She stood close to her daughter as he stepped out of the crowd. "I claim the Salt Throne," Euron stated, emerging from the crowd and standing before Yara. He nodded in greeting to her before looking to Lyanna. who he smiled at as if he had just appeared talking about the weather. Then he turned to the crowd. "When did you return, uncle?" Yara asked before he could address the crowd. She could not recall the last time she had seen Euron, but she had heard of him from her father and mother. It was bad enough that he was here just after her father's death, as if it didn't raise questions about what had happened to Balon. "A few days ago. I had some things to take care of." "Long overdue," Euron stated smugly. He watched Yara, wondering just what she was going to do now. It had been a long time since he had seen little Yara. She had certainly taken after her mother in the looks department, no doubt, but it appeared that in every other way, she was her father's daughter from what he had heard of her in passing. "I'm glad you're here. Now I know what my first act as queen will be. To execute the man who killed my father," Yara stated, her hand resting on her blade as she watched him closely, knowing that it could not be a coincidence that her father died after his return. The men murmured to each other, no doubt catching on to what Yara was implying happened to her father, and she refused to back down as Euron stepped closer to her and her mother. "I did. I killed him. Threw him right over a rope bridge and watched him fall. He was leading us nowhere, and we would still be heading there if it weren't for me. No one loved him. No one wanted to follow him. He led us into 2 wars we couldn't win. I apologize to you all for not killing him years ago," Euron stated aloud for everyone to hear. Yara glared at him, unable to believe that he had the nerve to brag about murdering her father, especially in front of her poor mother, who had lost so much in her life. "That would have been hard to do. You weren't here. Last I heard, you were gallivanting around the world having a grand old time," Yara spat. Shaking her head, she gripped her blade, knowing that she could take him down with one strike, but refused to lash out. It would do her no good to stab her uncle in the back like he had done to her father. She looked to her uncle, who seemed uncaring of what was happening. "I will build the largest fleet the world has ever seen," Yara stated, knowing she could not allow him to push her out. He was trying to undermine her and make her seem weak. This was a vote, and she had to show that she wasn't going to be pushed about by anyone, least of all her crazy uncle, who had been missing for many years now. "Right idea, except I'm the one who's going to build the Iron Fleet because I'm the one who knows how to use it. Behave been all over the world. Behave seen more of it than all of you combined. And across the sea, a person hates the great lords of Westeros just as much as we do. Someone with a large army, 3 large dragons, and no husband. I'm going to build that fleet, and I'm going to gallivant right over and give it to Daenerys Targaryen along with my big cock," Euron bragged, making the Ironborn laugh at his words. Yara shifted awkwardly. She had no doubts that Euron thought he was God's gift to women, and his words irritated her, knowing that the Dragon Queen would bow to no one. "You're going to seduce the Dragon Queen?" Yara scoffed. Her intel told her that he had married some Lannister bitch who had fled when the family fell. No doubt his new bride would not be pleased with his plans. Her eyes moved across the crowds, spotting a woman dressed in red with blonde hair who looked pleased with what Euron was saying. "I'm not going to seduce her. The Iron Fleet will seduce her. And together, we're going to take the 7 kingdoms. I wasn't born to be king. I paid the iron price, and here I stand," Euron shouted, leading to the Ironborn to cheer and chant his name. He reveled in the cheering, knowing that he could bring the Ironborn to greatness, the likes that Balon could never have imagined, and he could taste his victory was in hand. Lyanna moved through the crowd to stand beside her husband. Between them, they would crush Westeros, bring them all to their knees, and beg her for forgiveness. She could see it now, her children pleading with her for mercy and begging her to save them from the Dragon Queen when she buried down everything that they held dear. Arthur would kneel first, no doubt. He would see reason and do as his mother wanted when he realized that there was no winning against the 3 dragons of Daenerys Targaryen. He would forgive him and Destan for their waywardness. There would be no saving Sanira or any of her children. They would either bend the knee to the Dragon Queen or be burned, and Lyanna knew which she would prefer in the long run. Lyanna would never forgive her daughter for what she had done to her family. She should stood there and allowed House Lannister to fall and put some dwarf in command as if Tyrion wasn't just as much a traitor as she was. Tywin would be rolling in his grave if he knew that Tyrion had gotten his dirty claws on Casterly Rock and that the beast that killed his wife had succeeded in being his heir. Yara looked at her mother, who stared past her grimly at Euron, who was soaking up the cheers from the crowds. They both knew there was no coming back from this. Euron had clearly won this vote even after admitting that he had murdered her father. He would not be able to keep the promises that he had made, and Yara knew that she could not stay here, nor could her mother. If there was one thing that she knew, she would never be safe with Euron as king of the Iron Islands. Several Ironborn carrying flags stand on the shore, with Lyanna watching proudly as Euron kneels in the water and Aeron pushes him down under the water. Later that day, Euron was officially welcomed as the king of the Iron Island, his coronation taking place so quickly that there had barely been time to prepare. It did not escape Lyanna's notice that Yara and her mother were missing from the celebrations, no doubt licking their wounds after Yara had lost the vote. May Euron, your servant, be born again from the sea as you were. Bless him with salt. Bless him with stone. Bless him with steel, Aeron stated, holding the back of his other's head as he spoke, his words meaning little to Lyanna as she watched with little interest. She would be queen, rise higher than even her brother had when he had been alive, and bring down those who had tried to wipe House Lannister from the map. Listen to the waves. Listen to the god. He speaks to us and says we shall have no king but Euron Greyjoy. Let the sea wash your follies and your vanities away. Let the old Euron drown. Let his lungs fill with seawater, Aeron stated, holding Euron down under the water as he started to drown. He thrashed slightly against Aeron's hold on him, his brother not deterred as he continued speaking as if nothing was happening. Let the fish eat the scales of his eyes. What is dead may never die but rises again harder and stronger, Aeron said as finally, Euron stopped moving. He released his grip on his brother before nodding for two Ironborns to approach. They carry Euron onto the shore, where Aeron and the other Ironborn gather in attendance to stare at Euron, who does not move. There is silence before one man begins to walk closer to Euron, who suddenly gags and starts to cough up water. He props himself up on his arms and legs, spitting up water and gasping for air. Aeron finally approaches, retrieving a crown made of driftwood and placing it upon Euron's head, even as he slumps forward slightly, trying to catch his breath. What is dead may never die, Aeron states, the crowd echoing his words and cheering as Euron rises to his feet and looks to the crowd triumphantly. He moves to wrap an arm around Lyanna, who dodges him in disgust. A look passed across Euron's face before he shook it off and turned his attention to the gathering, his eyes noticing who was still missing from his coronation. Where are my niece and sister-in-law? Let's go murder them, Euron announced to the crowd with a laugh. He led Aeron and the Ironborn up to a seaside cliff that looked out across the ocean, only to be greeted by the sight of a fleet of ships sailing away from Pike. They stole our best ships, Aeron pointed out with a shake of his head. He could not believe what he was seeing. He had thought that perhaps Yara would be better than this to steal away the fleet while everyone else was attending Euron's coronation. Won't be enough to save them, Euron dismissed. He would catch up to Yara eventually as there was nowhere for her to run. She could not outsail him. She had no allies to turn to now. He turned to face the Ironborn, who watched their ships sail away into the distance and knew that this was far from over. Go back to your homes. Chop down every tree you can find. Quarter saw the timber and start building. I want every man bending planks. I want every woman spinning flax for sails. Build me 1,000 ships, and I will give you this world, Euron announced, raising his fist. He would make them the greatest nation the realm had seen, and people would remember his reign and how he propelled the Ironborn into the history books. Looking back at the Iron Islands as she sailed away, Yara took a deep breath, hoping that she was playing her cards right. She knew that if she got this wrong, then Euron would execute them all before they had their chance to escape. If Euron planned to ally with a dragon queen, Yara would place her bet on another queen. She felt this one wouldn't take too kindly to what Yara had to tell her. Queen Sanira would be thrilled to hear where her traitor mother had been hiding. She would no doubt reward Yara for such information, and planned to deal with the Dragon Queen before she ever landed on Westeros soil. Chapter 8, The Targaryen Wedding. Taking a deep breath as he prepared himself, Jon couldn't help but feel completely out of place as he waited for his bride to arrive. He stood beside the officiating septon, who was reciting several prayers to the audience. These included readings from their holy text, the seven-pointed star, while Jon stood waiting with the septon between the statues, and the bride waited outside the room for the ceremony to begin. Only once the prayers and readings were completed was Lena led into the room on the arm of Stannis in place of her brother, who was in the front row with their uncle watching the wedding. After the short walk down the aisle, Stannis silently presented Lena to Jon without saying a word, unlike a marriage done under the old gods. Lena had foregone the veil that many brides might have worn in this situation, she had opted for a cream-color gown elegantly decorated with colored embroidery that represented her house. "You may now cloak the bride and bring her under your protection," the Septon told Jon with a nod now that the couple were together and the ceremony could begin in earnest. Jon removed the initial cloak Laena had been wearing over the top of her dress from around her shoulders, the cloak displaying the sigil of her noble house, before putting a new cloak on her with the sigil of his house on it. It was still strange to think that he was of House Targaryen and that House Stark was no longer the house he represented and called his own when he had been Ned Stark's bastard for so long. Lena's face revealed nothing of how she was feeling. She ignored the glaring from her uncle, knowing that he would never forgive her for what she did that day. "My lords, my ladies, we stand here in the sight of gods and men to witness the union of man and wife. One flesh, one heart, one soul, now and forever," the Septon proclaimed to the gathering of lords and ladies from across the realm. There was no doubt that this marriage would need to be a success. There was much depending on it from Stannis' point of view, especially regarding the Stark alliance. Robb and Sanira were seated in the front row, the two holding hands as they watched the southern marriage unlike theirs. Then, taking each other's hands, Jon and Laena stood side by side as the Septon tied a ribbon around their joined hands to symbolize their union. "Let it be known that Laena of House Velaryon and Daeron of House Targaryen are one heart, one flesh, one soul. Cursed be he who would seek to tear them asunder," the Septon said, tying the knot around the hands to join them together. The room was silent, not even a whisper. As they watched the union be made, Corwin gritted his teeth, feeling his power slipping away from him as Laena married the Stark bastard. "In the sight of the seven, I at this moment seal these two souls, binding them as one for eternity," the Septon announced before he started to unravel the ribbon. "The two remain metaphorically joined for the rest of their lives." Then, the Septon looked upon the couple, his eyes taking in that Targaryen heir and his bride, seeing them for what felt like the first time. "Look upon each other and say the words," the Septon instructed one another to speak their vows, leading to Jon and Laena turning to look at one another, both knowing that there was no backing out of this now. "Father, smith, warrior, mother, maiden, crone, stranger," the couple chanted together, the vows feeling foreign on Jon's lips, knowing he had never prayed to these gods. He had been raised on the old gods. It was to them that he had sworn his vows for the Night's Watch, and it was to them that he felt a closer connection than these southern gods. "I am hers, and she is mine. From this day until the end of my days," Jon recited his vows at the same time Laena said her own. She held his hand tightly, knowing that the hard part was nearly over. "With this kiss, I pledge my love," Jon stated before kissing Laena for the first time. The kiss was short before they turned to face the audience that applauded the couple. "I am sure Jon will be happy," Robb noted, watching the man still consider his brother to enjoy his wedding feast. The celebration was a rather muted affair compared to the celebrations for Robb's wedding to Sanira, but Stannis had spared little expense. The marriage between Jon and Laena was to be recognized, a new chapter in the Targaryen legacy that would see them become a vassal house to House Baratheon. "I am sure they will get along well," Sanira noted, standing beside her husband. She tried to ignore the anxiety she felt at a wedding like this that brought back memories of Edmure's wedding. Her hand rested on the swell of her stomach, proof that she had moved past the pain caused by the betrayal of Roose Bolton and Walder Frey. Laena had spent a little time in Sanira's presence since the agreement that Jon would wed her. She had seemed nice enough, if not a little reserved, though Sanira would not hold that against her. Robb smiled at that and rested a hand against Sanira's growing belly. There was not a moment that he didn't enjoy watching her. Motherhood seemed natural to her. He enjoyed watching her with their two sons. "What do you think this one will be?" Sanira asked, knowing that either way, she did not care. She had secured the succession with Carlin and Osric. Any further child would be a blessing for their family. After fearing that she could not get pregnant again after losing Eddard, she would love any child that she had, no matter what it was or what they did with their lives. "A girl, beautiful as her mother," Robb stated with a grin. He had no idea what he would do if he did. He had no doubts that he would be protective of a daughter that he would love with all his heart. Although he knew that he would have to let a daughter go, he was in the middle of arranging a marriage for Sansa at this time, his sister having been offered several options before they had left for Riverrun. It had been 3 years since her marriage to Tyrion Lannister had been annulled, the dwarf being more than helpful in the situation, but she could not hide out at Winterfell forever. Sansa had seemed receptive to the idea of marrying again, especially with Robb allowing her to choose the man she would spend her life with. although Caitlin had tried to stick her opinions into the mix. You have your heart set on such? Sanira laughed, knowing that Robb would never care how many sons she could give him, nor if she gave him daughters for the rest of their lives. Their marriage might not have been easy, and they'd had their rough patches, but it was built on their love and support. I may do, Robb joked with a smile. He loved seeing Sanira so carefree, and he knew that her dreams were bothering her more than ever. He listened when she spoke of the feelings that she was flying through the air. It was not something he expected that he could understand. He valued what her visions brought and tried to learn from them so they would never face a wedding like the phrase again. Lyra, Robb stated with a fond smile. He'd thought about the name for a while and knew he wanted a strong name for their first daughter. The first princess of the North for hundreds of years was one that he had considered and now felt confident about bringing up to Sanira. And what if it's a boy? Sanira said, shaking her head. She knew there were old tales about how you could tell what the baby would be, but she didn't believe them. There was no telling what the child would be before they came into the world. She would find out well before Robb, since he wasn't allowed to be in the birthing chamber when the child was born. Thorin, Robb stated without missing a beat. He grinned, knowing that he was prepared either way and was sure Carlin and Osric would love another brother, even if he'd prefer a daughter. It appears you have it all sorted then, Sanira joked, shaking her head. She looked over at Jon and Laena, wishing their marriage would be as happy as her one with Robb. Jon would need all the support he could get, especially if the whispers that the Golden Company brought with them were anything to go by, and they would have to deal with the Dragon Queen sooner rather than later. Chapter 9, Strengthened Alliance. I do not wish to go, Deston argued, shaking his head as he looked between his sister and brother. He could not believe what he was hearing, that they had sold him off to the highest bidder, and now he was expected to leave everything he knew. He had always done as they had asked him. He had gone to be a ward and trained hard under the tutorage of the Karstarks. He had never questioned anything they had asked of him. I know this is a lot to ask, Arthur said, shaking his head. He honestly didn't want to agree to such a match for his younger brother, but there would be no better offer for Deston. Deston was a second son, unlikely to inherit anything since Arthur and now had two sons that secured House Tremaine's succession in Airedale. A lot to ask. You're asking me to give up everything. Deston snapped, shaking his head and turning away from Arthur. He looked to Sanira, hoping that she would argue in his favor, only to see the look on her face. He looked away quickly, unable to believe they would send him south and that he would be sent away from the north instead of being allowed to serve the family like he had always wanted to. It was bad enough that he'd been forced to watch from the sidelines as the war raged on, and he was kept away from the fighting, hidden away like a child while his sister and brother claimed victories. If there was another way, we would take it, Deston. But there is not, and we need to keep the peace with Stannis, Sanira told him calmly. She knew there was no way around such a match. And they had to make sacrifices, especially with what they knew about Jon. They needed to offer Stannis something that wouldn't seem like a threat. Rickon was out of the question because he was a Stark. I would not ask this of you if there was another way. You shall be Shireen's prince consort, the father of her children, Sanira explained, stepping closer to Deston. There were worse fates that could befall a younger brother, and she knew that nothing would happen to Deston while he was in such a position of power. No better than Laena Velaryon, Deston scoffed with a shake of his head. He recalled how ill-fated Laena had been when he had married Princess Rhaenyra and how they had wished that the Velaryon boys were not his. Perhaps he, too, would die so that Shireen could marry a man that she found to be a better match. The only bonus was that all of Shireen's uncles were dead by this point. What you make of the marriage is your own. Shireen is a sweet girl. I think you'll find you have a lot in common with her, Sanira said, trying to reason with Deston, who looked far from impressed that he was going to have to do this. The three siblings were silent, knowing that this could be the last time they were all together. Sanira and Arthur would bond to the north, while Deston was to be sent south for the rest of his life. Stannis expects you to be in King's Landing within 3 months, Sanira said, knowing that it gave him time to sort everything out and prepare himself for the trip. His entire life was about to be upended. He would likely never step back into the north if everything went as planned, but there was no telling what the future would hold. Deston nodded. He couldn't bring himself to look at Sanira or Arthur, doubting that he would ever forgive them for agreeing to such a match without consulting him. The door to the chamber opened, and Sanira turned to see Lyanna stepping into the room. Her lady looked uncomfortable about interrupting the conversation but would not have come if it was not important. My apologies, Your Grace, but an issue has arisen that needs your urgent attention in the Grand Hall, Lyanna said awkwardly. She had come right away when the guests had arrived before even King Robb had sent her. Sanira furrowed her brow. She could not imagine what would make Lyanna so nervous that she had come here to speak with her at such a time. But the look on her longest-serving lady told her it couldn't be ignored. Sanira made her way out of the room, knowing that whatever was going on could only be bad news. Entering the great hall, Sanira paused at the sight of several Ironborn that had gathered in the room, her eyes sweeping across the gathering to land on Robb and Yara conversing in the center of the great hall. The room seemed quiet as she made her way to the center. She ignored the looks from some of the Ironborn and the Northern Lords as she approached to find out what was happening. Robb eyed Sanira as she stopped by his side. He nodded gravely at her as he tried to wrap his head around what he had just been told. The Iron Islands have descended into civil war, Robb murmured, shaking his head, knowing that this was the last thing they needed right now, especially after hearing from Yara that Euron planned to ally himself with Daenerys Targaryen. The idea was that Euron would provide the Dragon Queen with boats to come to Westeros and overthrow everything they had worked so hard to achieve when they marched south to deal with the Lannisters. Sanira took a deep breath. She wished she could have seen this coming, but the look on Yara's face told her that the grim news would only get worse. My uncle has murdered my father, claimed the Salt Throne, and has announced his intention of allying with Daenerys Targaryen, Yara stated bluntly. She saw no reason to beat around the bush and knew what she had come here to do. It would not be easy, and she knew that the moment Euron found out what she had done, he would come after her to get rid of his only opposition. He has married Lyanna Lannister, Yara admitted, knowing that Lyanna was wanted in the north for her actions during the war and the murder of her husband, Roland Tremaine. The room was silent at the news that Lyanna had finally resurfaced after all those months. King's Landing had been searched in the days after the siege had taken place. But there had been no sign of her. Sanira's face betrayed nothing of how she felt at the news that her mother had finally shown back up, nor that she had remarried a man who planned to ally himself with Daenerys Targaryen. Inside, she was furious. She wanted to strangle her mother, and she wanted her to pay for the pain that she had put their family through with her selfish actions. Why are you here? To ask for our help? To swear loyalty? Robb asked, trying to understand what was happening. He didn't know why Yara had come here to them when the Ironborn tended to keep their issues between themselves. It didn't make sense that she would come to them and willingly give them the information she was giving without expecting something in return. Yara scoffed. She had thought about this long and hard, and the last thing that she wanted to do was give the Starks an ego boost, but she had nowhere else to turn right now. We both realize how bad it would be if Euron brought the Dragon Queen to our shores. My uncle is a madman who will watch the world burn if he gets his way, Yara said with a shake of her head. There would have been no winning if Euron had not stopped, and she could not do that alone without help. It wasn't her strongest point, and she knew that she would have to concede some of her power to get the Starks to help her, but it would be worth it if it allowed her to regain her inheritance and bring her father's killer to justice. I shall bend the knee to the north, swear my allegiance in return for your support in reclaiming my home and bringing my uncle to justice for what he has done. I shall give the North and her realms a naval fleet that the rest of Westeros will envy, Yara vowed, knowing that this was the only way that the Iron Islands could survive. They had spent the last few years rotting away and picking fights with the North that they could never win. Perhaps it was time to cast aside the isolation they had enforced on themselves and become a part of something bigger. You'd bend the knee to me? Robb asked, unsure that he had heard Yara right. He had never thought he would see the day he would face another Greyjoy again. It had been hard when Theon betrayed him, and he wasn't sure that he had forgiven the man he had once called brother, not enough to believe a word from his sister. I would bend the knee to her, Yara corrected, looking directly at Sanira, a woman she would bend for after everything she had seen. Chapter 10, The Iron Islands. Wrinkling her nose as she walked around the castle she now called home, Lyanna Lannister couldn't help but think about how much of a downgrade this place was compared to the castle at Airedale. Airedale had paled compared to Casterly Rock, but it was nothing compared to the cesspit she now called her home. Lyanna wondered what her brother would think of her now. The last true Lannister standing. Perhaps he would then see her worth, that she had been worthy of his attention and respect, that it was through her that their house would survive after everyone else had failed. Tyrion and the two Hill bastards that had been fathered by Jaime with Cersei were not Lannisters as far as Lyanna was concerned. She refused to see them as such after they had betrayed her family. Stopping by a window, Arlena tried to control her rage as she thought of her family that had turned on her. Arthur and Deston were now lost to her because they had sided with their sister. Because of Sanira, she had lost everything. Her useless daughter couldn't even die right and instead caused the downfall of Arlena's house. The news that Sanira now had 2 healthy sons and a 3rd child on the way was not endearing to Arlena, who hoped to see her daughter suffer for all the perceived slights against her. Not even the news that Arthur had his own family, 2 sons, now seemed to reach her. She couldn't bring herself to, especially when her eldest betrayed her and sided with his sister. Ariana couldn't wait to see their faces and hear their pleas when they realized that she had come out on top, that they were all at her mercy, and that they had to dance along to whatever song she sang. If they had done as she wished in the first place, all would have been well, and they would have been safe. Instead, they had betrayed her house and cast it down to ruin. Sanira would have found herself as Joffrey's queen. She would have all the power now amassed and would have seen her children as the true rulers of the realm rather than the upstarts they were now. Arthur would have married a fine match from the Reach, and Deston would have been her darling boy by her side for the rest of her days. The doors to the chamber opened, snapping Arlena from her thoughts of victory, so sweet that she could almost taste it, and she turned to the 2 soldiers that had entered. "What is it?" Arlena demanded. She had not been expecting any interruptions today, and she knew that the fleet was still being rebuilt after Yara had stolen it from under Euron while he was being coronated. Arlena was thrilled at the idea. She was a queen now equal to her disobedient daughter, who complained about herself as Queen in the North, Queen of the Trident, and Queen of the Vale. "You have been summoned," one of the guards stated, his face covered in a helmet so that she couldn't see nor that of the other guard with him. His voice was gruff and revealed nothing more. Ariana pursed her lips. She looked at the 2 guards for a moment before huffed and waved her arm for them to lead the way as she followed them. The 2 guards led her through the halls of the keep. It was dark and miserable, and no one crossed their paths as they descended into the dungeons. "What is this?" Ariana asked. Confused, the light so poor that she couldn't see as they led her through the corridors, she wrinkled her nose at the smell of dampness as they walked deeper into the caverns. No answer came from the guards until they came to a complete stop, neither of them explaining anything as Arlena stopped behind them, confused. "What is going on?" Arlena demanded. She took a nervous step back, wondering what sort of trick her husband was playing on her this time. However, she was quickly stopped from leaving by 2 further guards behind her. "I am the queen. You can't do this to me," Arlena screeched as they took one of her arms and dragged her into the cell before her voice echoing in the dungeons before the cell was closed behind her as she was tossed inside. "Lady Mother," said a voice that made Arlena's blood run cold. She stumbled back and saw who was standing in front of her on the other side of the cell door. It had been 7 years since she had last seen Sanira. She hadn't looked back after leaving her only daughter at Winterfell. She had not cared to write to or speak of her once Sanira was no longer her problem. "How dare you come here? This is my home, my castle. You have no power here," Arlena stated. She would not bow to Sanira and would not fear someone who had no power to punish her for her actions. Euron would not bend the knee to Robb or Sanira. He wanted his own power source, which could only come from bringing the Dragon Queen to Westeros and restoring her to her throne. Sanira stared at her mother. She had thought about what she would say when she saw her again after everything that happened, but now there was nothing that filled her mind other than pity. Proud Arlena Lannister was a pitiful sight to behold. She had escaped every attempt to capture her and witnessed the fall of her house. There would be no escaping this time. They had ensured of that. Euron Greyjoy is unlikely to survive the battle. His men have deserted him, and the last time he was seen, he was screaming like a madman. Yara Greyjoy has bent the knee. "I am now Queen of the Iron Islands," Sanira explained calmly. She watched her mother, seeing the fury on her face as she turned red as the gown she wore. Despite everything that had happened, Arlena was still dressed in Lannister red, a proud statement of the house she belonged to, especially when she was one of the last members left after the war. Arlena gritted her teeth, her hands clenched at her sides as she stared at Sanira, wishing she could wrap her hands around her pretty little throat. She could not believe it would end like this. "Could you really execute your own mother?" Arlena taunted. She stared Sanira down, knowing that it was not something that her daughter would be able to do. Arlena doubted she would die that day. She didn't care what happened to Euron as the ball was already in motion to see the Starks toppled from their position with or without her help. For crimes against the realm, for the murder of my father, for the protection of my children. I would do anything, Sanira replied without emotion. She stared right back, knowing she would do anything to protect her children from her mother. Lyanna was a threat as long as she was alive. She would always plot against Sanira and her family to win the war that had seen House Lannister fall from grace. Covered in mud, surrounded by northern men and the man who had betrayed him to sail off with Yara, Euron Greyjoy gritted his teeth as he ducked and dodged the fighting surrounding him. His men were following one by one around him. The slaughter was immense, and he screamed, charging forward. His sword clashing with any man that dared cross his path. He planned on taking as many northerners down with him as possible. Then, he saw Yara, his niece, standing just feet from him, a sword in her hand, covered in mud as the rain poured down upon them as if the gods themselves were crying. Euron's hold on his sword tightened, raising it in the air to charge toward Yara to get rid of the only other claimant to his throne, his eyes focused on nothing other than her. It was there that he found himself at his end, a sword driven through his gut by a soldier that he didn't recognize, his eyes snapping away from Yara, who made no move to stop what was happening. Her men converged on Euron, their blades sinking into his flesh over and over as she stood and watched. Her father had been many things, but there would always be those loyal to him, and what Euron had done was unforgivable to them. Breathing heavily as he staggered forward, Euron tried to make his way over to Yara, his sword still in his hand as he tried to pretend that he was unaffected by the stab wounds that he had sustained. He gritted his teeth as he approached her, his arm barely able to lift his sword when he was finally in front of Yara, who didn't say a word to Euron as she drove her sword into his belly, dropping him to his knees. Staring down at the pitiful form of the man that had murdered her father, Yara didn't feel an ounce of regret as she slit his throat with her dagger, allowing Euron Greyjoy to slump backward into the mud. Chapter 11, Lyanna Lannister. Lyanna Lannister, daughter of Tytos Lannister and Jane Marbrand, sister of Tywin, Kevin, Jenna, and Jaerion Lannister, widow of Roland Tremaine, wife of Euron Greyjoy, and mother to Arthur, Sanira, and Destwan Tremaine, had been sentenced to death. Her trial had been swift even though she had refused to recognize the judge's authority on the matter. She hadn't even come to court to offer her defense nor hear the verdict when it had been given. Instead, Lyanna stayed in her cell, where she had been kept since she had been imprisoned. Ladies loyal to House Stark had been put in place to keep tabs on her. Every word Lyanna had spoken had been reported back, her rants about how she would avenge her fallen house, her deranged whispers about how the gods would not allow it to rain until she was released from prison. Lyanna had been treated well, given her station. No one could say that she had been left to rot in the cells, especially given her acts of treason against House Stark. The evening before she had dined upon the finest goose, she had drank wine she had brought to Pike. Her confessor had been in that morning to speak with her. She had spoken her truth and prayed that the gods would be kind to her. Lyanna still had hoped that she would be exiled for her actions. The ladies around her did not speak, for the most part. They were here to keep her comfortable, and the days dragged on as she awaited her execution. Staring out of the window of her cell, Lyanna couldn't help but ponder the life that she had lived and the future that she might have had if he'd not been married to Roland Tremaine. Arianna always felt she had been wasted on such a match. She should have been married to a great lord who would have afforded her the greatest luxury. The door to her cell opened, and Lyanna turned away from the window. She was dressed in Lannister red. She had been born a Lannister and would die as one. "Madam, the hour approaches. It would help if you made ready," Ser Roderick stated with a grim look. He had been charged with looking over Lyanna's care since her imprisonment. Arianna stood from her seat. She clasped her arms before her, and her lips pursed as she watched the man who had been her jailer since this mess had started. It had been Roderick who had brought her the news that she was a widow once more, that Euron had died on the battlefield when he had mounted his final stand against his niece, who had brought the northern army with her. "Acquit yourself of your charge, for I have been long prepared," Lyanna instructed. She was ready to die and had lived a life that she did not regret any of her actions. A part of her still didn't believe that this would happen. That at the last moment, Sanira would step in to stop her mother from being executed. She would be sent to Braavos in disgrace, where she could plot her revenge. "The Queen asks that you take this purse. It has 20 pounds to pay the headsman for his services," Ser Roderick stated, knowing everything had been arranged. It had been a long time coming, but Lyanna would pay for her crimes against the crown. How many people had lost their lives because of what she had done, the lives that had been destroyed because she had poisoned her first husband and refused to aid the Northern Army in its time of need? Lyanna took the purse, feeling the weight of the coins inside. Perhaps this was the money she would use to pay her way to Bravos. Lyanna and the ladies followed Ser Roderick out of the cell. They were followed along the way. The halls were quiet as they walked from the cells and out into the courtyard. Lyanna paused as she stepped out under the gray skies. The courtyard was empty apart from the platform erected in the center where the executor stood. A royal execution. Sanira grants me this dignity at least, Lyanna stated humorlessly. She was surprised to find that there was no audience for her execution, her hopes rising that they would banish her and instead execute some peasant. Surely, if there were no witnesses, then this was her chance to flee, that Sanira would not go through with ordering her own other's execution after all and bringing bad luck upon her family. Lyanna and her ladies made their way over to the execution platform, her ladies sticking close to her as Lyanna climbed the steps and made her way towards the masked executioner who was waiting for her with his assistant. There was a chill in the air, winter creeping up on them quicker with each passing day, and Lyanna paused in the middle of the platform for a moment before her ladies stepped forward to take her fur-lined red cloak from her. Ariana tried to keep her hands from shaking as she stared at the executor. She held the coin purse tightly and looked around, waiting for some sign that she would be released. It was then that Lyanna saw Sanira, dressed in black with a black cloak around her, her head covered as she stood away from the platform. Robb had tried to talk her out of watching, that she didn't need to do this, but Sanira had insisted, saying that she needed to see this to the end. If she was going to sign her other's death warrant, then she had to watch the deed being done. The mother and daughter stared at one another, neither saying a word while everything that had transpired crossed their minds, only thinking of the other's faults and betrayals. Lyanna then realized that this was happening, that there would be no last-minute reprieve, and that Sanira wouldn't allow her to escape to Bravos as she had thought. Nodding her head, fixing her hair as she moved towards the executioner and handed him his fee, she moved to the center of the platform again and held her head high. Sanira tried to look away, the guilt of what she was about to do bubbling in her stomach, but for the sake of her children and their safety, there was nothing that Sanira wouldn't do for them. Carlin, Osric, and her unborn child were her future, one that her mother threatened just by living. For that reason, she had affixed her signature to the execution warrant. "Don't close your eyes," Lyanna said, staring at Sanira. There was no hesitation in her movements as she got down on her knees. She clasped her hands in front of her, her eyes locked with Sanira's, hoping that this moment would haunt her. The House of Lannister would end with her. She might die, but she hoped that in her death, it would curse all those who had brought her family to its knees. "Because you know what you do this day," Lyanna spat. Sanira would be forever tainted for her actions, and her children would pay the price for it. Carlin, Osric, and the baby Sanira carried in her belly would never be safe. A lump formed in Sanira's throat. She willed herself to keep watching, and she wanted nothing more than to look away from the sight of the executioner picking up his sword. Lyanna prayed under her breath, not daring to look towards the man who was approaching her, knowing that she wanted this to be over quickly. She did not wish to suffer more than needed. It would be over quickly and cleanly. "So witness it," Lyanna ordered. She raised her head, giving the executioner the perfect angle to strike, her eyes never leaving Sanira's as the sword swung and cut off her head. Sanira felt her knees buckle and collapse under her, tears in her eyes as she hugged herself closely. She took deep breaths as she tried to wrap her head around the fact that it had happened. Lyanna Lannister, daughter of Tytos Lannister and Jane Marbrand, sister of Tywin, Kevin, Jenna, and Geryon Lannister, widow of Roland Tremaine, wife of Euron Greyjoy, and mother to Arthur, Sanira, and Destwan Tremaine, was dead. Sanira closed her eyes, fighting back the tears, knowing that she shouldn't grieve the woman who had betrayed her entire family and had caused her nothing but pain. There were footsteps behind Sanira, and she should have known he would support her. Robb moved to hold his wife. He couldn't imagine what she was going through now. The two of them were silent while Lyanna's body was carefully moved into the coffin that had been prepared for her. She would be sent to Casterly Rock to lay with her family that she had loved so much. That would be the only kindness they would allow her. It was on Tyrion to ensure her burial and transport. The Starks and Tremaines were washing their hands off her. Robb helped Sanira to her feet, the two of them sharing a look before Sanira hugged her husband, both knowing that Lyanna was just one of the problems that needed dealing with. Now, they could focus on what was coming from the north and the Dragon Queen across the sea. Chapter 12, Lady Sylvina Baratheon. It had been news that they had known was coming, shortly after returning to Winterfell after making treaties with Yara and the execution of Arlena, the news that Sylvina Baratheon had taken a turn for the worst. Her master did not think she had much longer to live, her health rapidly declining, and she had taken to her bed. She had refused to get up and had called for her confessor to give her the last rites. The halls of Becton were already dressed in mourning, and her ladies wept for their mistress. No one could have expected that she would decline so quickly that they had not seen it coming. Lady Syria Caswell had traveled from her marital home. She had been by her mother's side since the news had reached her. She couldn't believe she was about to become an orphan. It meant that she was the last of her family. Her father and older brother had already died, and she had kept a distance from her niece and nephews because she hadn't coped very well with the news that she would never have children of her own. Syria watched as her mother lay in her bed, her breathing labored as she slept, and she felt tears burn her eyes as she pondered everything that she had missed. Her husband had always been loving and tender. He had understood her grief at them never having children, and now he helped her run her mother's lands that would soon be her own. The doors to the chamber opened, and Syria pursed her lips as she saw Sanira enter the room. The younger woman moved to greet her aunt, who dropped into a stiff curtsy. "Your Grace," Syria murmured. Her husband had been quick to declare his loyalty for House Stark when Robb was made king. He had expressed his excitement, knowing that as aunt and uncle to the new queen, they would benefit from that somehow. Davin had been granted some royal warrants in recent months. His house was known for its horses and now provided horses to House Stark. Davin had even gifted ponies to the young princes so they could learn to ride. He was pleased that his gifts were warmly welcomed and hoped to be invited to court soon. That was Syria's worst nightmare. She had not been close with her niece or her nephews, and serving in Sanira's court at her behest was not something she wanted. Syria was too proud. "Sanira," Sylvina called, reaching out, smiling as she looked at her only granddaughter, who was quick to move to her side. Syria couldn't hide the jealous look on her face. To her, it was another sign of Roland's family being favored over her. It sucked to see her mother find everything that she was looking for in her granddaughter rather than her own daughter, and to watch Sylvina share their heritage with Sanira. "Mother," Sanira whispered. She sat on the bed beside her grandmother, who was propped up by pillows. It was strange to see the once strong Sylvina in such a way. It seemed like not too long ago that Sanira had been learning of her heritage from her grandmother, who had been eager to see their heritage passed on while she had the chance. "Perhaps I should fetch the maester," Sanira encouraged. She didn't like to see her grandmother suffer like this. She felt like she still had so much to learn, and she didn't feel ready to do so alone. Her grandmother had always been so kind and caring, a stark contrast to the woman that her mother had been. The execution of Arlena was still fresh in Sanira's mind. "There's nothing for a maester to see and, thank gods, nothing that some fool with a knife could think to cut out," Sylvina informed. She looked at Sanira, knowing there was nothing for her now. The last thing she wanted was to be poked and prodded by some foolish man in her last days. She had lived a good life and knew her time was coming. "My heart. It's beating strangely. I feel it skip a beat and then go slow." "It won't beat strongly again, Sanira," Sylvina explained. Her breathing labored as she looked past Sanira to Syria, who watched them with a cold look. It was hard to explain or express what was going on in her mind. She had so much to share. Now, her time was short, and she doubted she would last more than a couple of days. "Are you in any pain?" Sanira asked. She moved to fix the covers on her grandmother. Not wishing to upset her further than necessary, her grandmother sounded so certain of her fate that it left no room for any argument. Syria moved away from a scene before her, moving to speak with the ladies that had served her mother. Soon, they would be her household, and there would be changes to Becton that would have to make. "No. There's no pain for me except in knowing yours," Sylvina said quietly so that her words could not be overheard. She didn't broadcast her seeings any more than Sanira did. Sylvina reached for Sanira's arm. She knew she would not get to see the world that Sanira would usher in. She would not get to comfort her when things looked bad or celebrate her wins. "You will have another boy. Of that, I am sure, not this one nor the next, and what a boy he will be." "I'm sure of that, too," Sylvina mused, resting her hand on Sanira's bump. She was almost certain that the child that Sanira was carrying would be a daughter. As would the next child Sanira and Robb have, two beautiful daughters that would take after their mother that, Sylvina was sure. Then get well and stay with me. You have been with me through everything. Everything. I would not be here without you. None of us would be here without you, Sanira pleaded, tears in her eyes knowing she could not do this without her. They would have lost at the twins to House Fry if it hadn't been for Sylvina. Sylvina's intervention had seen the alliance begin with her speaking to her nephew to get him to come to the Starks' aid at the twins. And yet, here you are. And through you and your children, I will have found a line of kings. And queens, too, I think, Sylvina mused with a tired smile. Her work was done, and Sanira was stronger than she thought. The future was clear to her, the line would continue into the future, and they would be stronger than ever if everything she saw came to pass. I'm not ready, Sanira murmured. She needed her guidance and support. She wasn't ready to say her goodbyes, and she wished that there was something that she could do to make her grandmother better. Sylvina patted Sanira's hand. No one was ever ready to say goodbye, but it would not be goodbye forever, and they would see each other again. It is my will and intention that my lands and titles should be inherited by Prince Osric, Sylvina declared. She ignored the look of outrage from her daughter at the news that Becton would be inherited by Sanira's second son. Her rightful inheritance was ripped from under her to be given to the princeling, who was only a year old now. It would be many years before he was old enough to rule the lands in his own right. The room was filled with Sylvina's family. She had wanted to be surrounded by her nearest and dearest in her final moments. She was gray and looked ill against the whiteness of her pillows. Arthur and Elaine had arrived from Airedale with their two sons, Corin and Deston too, while Deston had come with the Baratheons, who had traveled to pay their respects to Sylvina as Stannis was her last remaining nephew. Syria and her husband lingered away from the others, keeping their distance as Sylvina's ladies wept openly for their mistress. Looking around the room, Sylvina couldn't help but smile at how blessed she was, and she knew without a doubt that all would be well. The alliance was strong and would survive her death. The North and South would need each other. The Dragon Queen was coming, and they needed to be prepared. The long night was upon them, and they would need the strength to survive. Sylvina gasped as she leaned back in her bed. She was ready to be reunited with Ronard and Roland. She was eager to see her parents and brother again after so long. In the corner of the room, Sylvina could see her mother, Princess Rhaegal Targaryen, waiting for her, a proud smile on her face as she stared at her only daughter. Sylvina suddenly gasped, her hand latching onto Sanira's, and a look of panic filled her face as the goddess blessed Sylvina Baratheon with one final vision. Gold and white, the final words passed Sylvina's lips as a breath before she slipped away, her eyes staring unseeing at Sanira, who bowed her head, unaware of how important Sylvina Baratheon's words would be. Chapter 13, The Queen Across the Sea. Staring up at her ancestral home, Daenerys Targaryen wasn't sure how she felt standing on the beach as she stared up at Dragonstone. Behind her stood those who had served her well and believed in her mission. Finally, she had come home. After living in exile for 24 years, her entire life was spent cast away by the usurper who had tried to have her killed. She wasn't sure how she felt about being home. It had been through Viserys that she had heard stories about their home, about the bad men that had taken the throne and cast them out, murdering their family and forcing them to live in exile. Ducking down, Daenerys grasped at the sand beneath her feet, allowing it to slip through her fingers. Her head bowed as she tried to wrap her head around the fact that she was really here. Daenerys took a moment to gather herself, getting back to her feet as a man approached them. He looked wary, taking in the army that had arrived on his doorstep. Lord Daeron Targaryen welcomes you to Dragonstone and awaits you in the throne room, the man said, taking in the foreign queen. He eyed her warily as he took in the people that gathered behind her. Undoubtedly, none had ever stepped foot in Westeros. They were foreigners as much as the woman who had come to claim the Iron Throne. Daenerys paused at the greeting, a frown on her face as she pondered the words. The name held no meaning, not even the fact they shared a name. Viserys had never mentioned a Daeron, and her knowledge was limited since she had no connections to mainland Westeros since Yora had been dismissed from her side. Missandei and Grey Worm shared a small look, but neither was sure what to make of another Targaryen, especially when Daenerys had often talked about being the last of her house and now there was one sitting in her ancestral home. Very well, take me to this, Lord Daeron Targaryen, Daenerys stated. She clasped her hands before her and stared up past the man towards Dragonstone. She would judge whether this other Targaryen would be a threat or an ally to her. She had no idea what to expect from this Lord Daeron, and her stomach turned, not knowing what to expect. Entering the throne room, Daenerys held her head high as she followed the man with Missandei and Grey Worm behind her. She couldn't stop taking in the room as she entered, everything feeling so foreign and unfamiliar. Finally, her eyes rested upon the man at the center of the room, her lips pursing at the sight of him, who looked far from what she had expected. Daenerys had thought that this Daeron Targaryen would look more like herself and Viserys, and that he would share the noted white blonde hair that all her family shared. Instead, here she found a man who looked nothing like she would have thought a Targaryen would look. He looked no different to her than the man who had brought her to the throne room. Beside him stood a woman who clearly held some Valyrian blood. She held her high proudly as she stared at Daenerys with a look that made her a little uneasy. "My lady aunt," Jon greeted awkwardly, even though they had known that Daenerys was coming from the reports they had received about her armada coming into sight. Messages had been sent to King's Landing to let them know that Daenerys had come to Westeros, hoping to launch her invasion of Westeros from the Targaryen seat like the Conqueror had done. "Welcome to Dragonstone, my lady," Lena stated politely. She looked to the other woman, who seemed less than pleased at what was happening. Perhaps she thought that Dragonstone would be empty since Stannis now resided in King's Landing. How much news could the Queen across the sea have about land she didn't know or understand? Lena had no intentions of surrendering her home. She would not allow Jon to do something stupid that would put them all at risk when he had a greater claim than this woman to their home and lands. Daenerys paused momentarily, waiting for the words, and neither Jon nor Lena would be willing to speak that would surrender Dragonstone to her as by right. It was her birthright. She was the daughter of King Aerys, sister of Prince Rhaegar and Prince Viserys. It was her destiny to restore her house to the throne and take back what was stolen from them. "Will you not surrender Dragonstone to me?" Daenerys asked. She clasped her hands before her as she looked between the man who claimed he was a Targaryen and the woman beside him. This was not the welcome home she had imagined. She had been told that the common folk longed for a Targaryen to return to the throne, yet one lived in the ancestral home. "You are in the presence of Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, the first of her name, Queen of the Undouls and the First Men, protector of the Seven Kingdoms, the mother of dragons, the Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, the Unburnt, the breaker of chains," Missandei stated as if to remind them who they were speaking with, that perhaps her titles would jog some memory that they needed to be loyal to. Lena snorted, slightly unimpressed by the list of titles that the woman before her thought should make them impressed. It was easy to see that she had dropped her hold of the titles she had held while in Meereen. "The Seven Kingdoms no longer exist as a united kingdom," Jon murmured awkwardly. He wasn't sure what to make of the woman who stood before him, the only link to the family he didn't know. He often wrote to Robb and knew it would be a while before they saw each other again, especially with the news he had been given that morning. "My husband is the son of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen from his marriage to Lyanna Stark. His claim is far greater than your own," Lena stated proudly. She refused to tolerate any threat to their home, and she would help Jon defend their home in any way that she could. Daenerys stared at Jon, her face blank of emotion as she tried to wrap her head around what she was being told. It starkly contrasted the tales she had been told about Rhaegar and his time with Lyanna. Daenerys took a step back, the world around her suddenly feeling unsecured as her mind caught up on what that meant for her and her claim to the throne. Here stood someone with a better claim to the Iron Throne than she did. Everything she had based her life on since Viserys had died could be a lie. There was a council held to examine Daeron's claim, witnesses called upon to assure that the truth was discovered. "Daeron is the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, legitimate in the eyes of the Seven by the marriage of his parents before Rhaegar's death," Lena informed the room. She could see the cogs in Daenerys' mind turning, and she was ending any doubt. Daeron was the rightful heir and had renounced the Targaryen claim to the throne, content to rule Dragonstone and find peace here after everything that had happened to him. "I understand that this must be shocking news to you, that it might come as a complete surprise," Jon said, watching the look on Daenerys' face. He could still recall Maester Aemon's words about Targaryens alone in the world being a terrible thing. She had undoubtedly spent many years thinking she would be the last Targaryen, only to return to Westeros to find she wasn't so alone in the world and everything she had hoped would not happen. There was no grand welcoming, no one plotting to restore House Targaryen to the throne. The people had enough of war. They had suffered for years under the war against the Lannister, and there was finally peace. "We are more than happy to offer you a place to rest," although we must advise that your presence here has been reported to King Stannis, Jon stated, knowing that her presence here could not be ignored. The last thing he wanted was for Stannis to deem himself some threat. Daenerys' presence here would not go unnoticed. The dragons themselves were eye-catching. Lena had watched their approach and had been in awe as she stood at the top of Dragonstone. Lena had told Jon about how two of her ancestors had been dragon riders and how her namesake had ridden the legendary dragon Vhagar. "Thank you," Daenerys said, forcing a smile on her face. She was not finished yet and knew she had to play her cards right to regain her family's throne from the usurper. Chapter 14, Not So Welcome Home. Looking out across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen couldn't help but feel a little disappointed about how her return home had gone. She had not been welcomed back as she expected, nor the one that she had dreamt about all these years. The warm welcome that she had been told about by many, the whispers of how the common people prayed for her return, to see her house restored to their rightful throne. That they wove the Targaryen flag in secret. She recalled how her brother had listened to Illyrio Mopatis when arranging to marry her off to Khal Drogo, of how they drank secret toasts to his health and called out to him as the rightful king. Daenerys looked down at her hands as she thought of the time since she had arrived at her ancestral home. She had felt nothing more than a prisoner here, even though she could wander where she pleased. Her every move was watched, her army all but captured despite her most trusted allies being treated well and allowed the same freedoms. Daenerys was still attended to by Missandei, who served as her trusted advisor and handmaiden since she had been freed as an interpreter to Krasny's Mo Naklas of Astapor. It gave her a sense of freedom even if Missandei had been joined by ladies that were no doubt spies, reporting back to her every move. She didn't trust either of them even as they followed her around Dragonstone. Daenerys was grateful for Missandei's presence. She was among Daenerys's most loyal subordinates. No matter what Daenerys did, she would support her and vouch for him. She didn't know what she would do if Missandei ever decided that she wished to leave. Grey Worm and Yora had also followed her when she had made her trip, leading her armies and loyal to a fault. She trusted them to keep her army prepared since she had not been permitted to meet with them. Then there had been Ser Barristan Selmy, who had come to her when dismissed from the usurper's guard. He had been loyal to her since he had arrived, guiding as best as he could and telling her stories of the family she didn't know. He had warned her not to make the same mistakes as her father and that if she wanted to rule, she had to be different from Aerys. He crossed a continent to serve Daenerys. He had been a loyal friend, and he died in an alley, butchered by cowards who hid behind masks. "Your Grace," Missandei whispered, the cold wind biting at her, and a part of her wished that they had stayed in Meereen. She missed the sun against her skin and the soft material of her dresses that had been replaced with heavy furs and materials that irritated her skin. This was not what she had pictured when they had set sail from Meereen, the conquest seeming so different from the others. Missandei had watched as Daenerys claimed the unsullied army, defeating the enslavers of Astapor, how she had taken what was hers, and how loved she was by the people. Coming to Westeros, the home of her ancestors, had been rather disappointing in comparison. There had been no warm welcome, and the people weren't crying out or welcoming her like they had done everywhere else they had done. It was like they didn't know that she was Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne, rightful queen of the Undulls and the First Men, protector of the Seven Kingdoms, the mother of dragons, the Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, the Unburnt, the breaker of chains. Daenerys dropped the title Queen of Meereen after they left and installed the council led by the Second Sons instead of focusing on her claim to the Iron Throne. "This isn't what I imagined when I came here. I expected at the very least a warm welcome from the common folk, but here I have received nothing but coldness," Daenerys said quietly. She looked back over her shoulder at Missandei, who moved closer so that their words could not be overheard. Neither trusted the two ladies that stood not too far away. The women were dressed finely for ladies and had been part of Lady Lena's household before being sent to serve Daenerys. "I thought Viserys was a fool for believing what was said," Daenerys said, shaking her head. She looked across the bay towards King's Landing, unsure what her path was now that this wasn't going as planned. Now she felt like a fool that she had believed the tales that she had once thought Viserys had been a fool for believing in, that she had thought herself better than her brother. No one seemed to care that she had arrived at Dragonstone, almost like they didn't know she was there. They didn't realize that the true heir to the throne had returned. Missandei stared at Daenerys, wishing that there was something that she could do to help her. She rested a hand on hers, knowing that she would help in any way that she could to achieve her dream. "Perhaps you could make a deal with this Lord Targaryen," the man that claims to be your nephew, Missandei, I know, did not believe that the man was the son of Daenerys' oldest brother. It felt far too convenient that he had appeared just before Daenerys had arrived on Dragonstone. The false king had no doubt planted him to ward off any attempts by Daenerys to claim her ancestral home, but they could use this to their advantage. Missandei knew that Daenerys would have her choice of suitors. Perhaps there was something to be done with this Lord Daeron Targaryen. She had seen how Daenerys had used men to get what she wanted. Daenerys paused momentarily. She stared at the sea and pondered what Missandei had to say. Perhaps she could use this Daeron to her advantage. Daenerys had come a long way from the naive girl she had been before she had married Khal Drogo. She was not just some girl. She was a woman whose dreams came true, and she had returned to reclaim her father's throne. Her eyes caught on her 3 dragons, flying in the skies above Dragonstone, probably the first dragons to do such a thing since the dance, and a sight not seen in hundreds of years. Watching the sight before him, Jon couldn't quite wrap his head around what he saw, even if it was happening before his eyes. Jon doubted he would ever be comfortable seeing 3 dragons growing larger daily than they were staying here at Dragonstone. Never had he imagined this would happen in his 24 years, that he would see the sight of dragons in the sky above him. Ghost trotted up to him. The white dire wolf had been his loyal companion and had followed him from the Night's Watch to his new position as Lord of Dragonstone. "You should be resting," Jon noted, turning his head to look at Laena as she appeared. Ghost seemed to have become her protector since her pregnancy had become more noticeable, and Jon was grateful for that. Laena smiled, moving to stand beside her husband. She looked out across the sea with him, thrilled at how caring he had become since she had announced her pregnancy. "I wanted to check in on you. Our guests are growing restless, and I have no doubt that she hopes to travel to King's Landing soon enough," Laena noted quietly. She squeezed Jon's arm, knowing that a lot was riding on them right now. Stannis had no intentions of welcoming Daenerys anywhere near King's Landing, not when she arrived with 3 dragons, 8,000 unsullied, and 100,000 Dothraki at her call, all camped on the beach at Dragonstone. "I am doing what I can. I feel like everyone is watching me and waiting for me to screw this up," Jon murmured, his voice rough, and he knew that this was all some sort of test. No one was sure where they stood right now, all watching and waiting to see what Daenerys' next move would be. The realm was not entirely ready for another war on their doorstep. "You won't." "I don't think she is in as much control as she believes," Laena noted, kissing his cheek. She had watched the army from a distance, taking note, and felt like Daenerys had brought with her was undisciplined and unprepared for what was to come. The sound of screeching above made the 2 of them stare up at the sky. One of Daenerys' dragons with green and bronze-colored scales with yellow-orange-colored wings flying above them. Jon didn't know what it was, but he felt he couldn't take his eyes off the dragon, almost as if it were calling out to him as it flew overhead. "All will be well," Laena assured her husband. She was here to aid him and knew they had to keep level heads, especially when dealing with Daenerys.